Bitches. It's almost like I never left. Let's see how that's so wrong. There you go, you stupid fucking thing. Pardon my language. I bought myself my yearly new drink container. What is it? My hand. Is the color coming off? Am I just seeing things because it's like an off-white and with a little bit of water it provides a shadow? I'm not seeing anything. Doesn't seem to be leaking. I have a nice coffee in there, but it is too frozen, so it just tastes like regular coffee, and it's like that. I'm gonna let that melt for a while. Alrighty. I'm going to cut your head open because I need to see what's happening in there. And I know better. I knew better, but I did it anyway. I shouldn't use the liquid scissors. If you're new to my crafting live streams, it's pretty boring. I sit here, work on stuff, listen to videos, and yeah. That's what I'm working on. Got the hotel booked for the Halifax Oddities Market, so that's exciting. I don't think I want that eye. I want this one. Yeah. Okay. Gonna make the base with the hot glue, and there we go. No! What happened? Refresh, bitch. Yeah, I know it's my second live stream of the night. I'm trying to get through those books again, but dear God, I'm so out of practice when it comes to reading out loud, it's not even funny. There we go. What do you think of Rib Kitty? Probably add something more to him. I just don't know what right now. I did cut something apart. Well, it's not much of a tail together, though. Not so much of a tail. Or horn. Back ribs? No. There it is. I did cut this out of a spider to do the back, but I'm not sure now. Can't really see it, especially if it's going to be sitting. So I might use the back ribs for something else. But yeah. Hey guys, if you're new to live stream, this is the world's most boring live stream where I work on craft and art projects while listening to something on YouTube and pretty much ignoring the chat because I forget it's there. But yeah, I got the Halifax Oddities Market and the Miramichi Horror Fest coming up this month, and I'm in panic mode, so let's make some weird ass shit. This one, I got this creepy music box. So I'm gonna put it in the head and have it so when you pull the eyeball, it'll make the music box play. I'm gonna put a little string in the back of the head so it'll stick out a little bit, so when you pull the eye, you won't just pull it all the way out. Yeah. Hi, Glitchman. What do you think? And then when you pull the eye out of the dog's head, it'll play the creepy music box. Well, it makes me some side money, which is great considering my last paycheck from work for 8 hours was $70.38. So yeah, kind of need a little bit of a side hustle going on. Hello, Glitchman. I say hi. There we go. Makes the head heavy, so I'm probably going to stitch him so he sits. Maybe I can add Wibs. Too small. Kid here. I don't have any kids. Do you have kids? I have no children. I have a cat. Okay, I think I'm gonna have to do the hot glue, which means I need the water. 38 hours, you crazy fool! That sucks. I remember when I was casual at my former work, and I would get like my 75 hours in the first week when it was supposed to be like 75 hours in 2 weeks. Yeah, it's not my favorite. Fuck, that's hot. I'm using my finger dipped in water to move the hot glue around before it sets to make a cavity for the eyeball. But I have to make sure whatever finger I stick in there is wet so the hot glue doesn't stick and I don't get burns. That'll do it. There we go. Oh, no. Wet. You get wet. It smells like burning. Probably me, though. There we go. Kind of like that. The other one will just be a gorged out missing eyeball, but a little bit wider. Oh, shoot. That looks like a lovely little cavity for the eye socket. What do you guys think? I don't know. If I'm out of frame, just let me know. I'll work on moving the camera over and myself as well. Unfortunately, I'm one of them lap workers where if I work on anything, it's just like all bunched up in my lap. So when you look down, all you see is the top of my head. Oh, I need a new hot glue stick. I would like to get some black hot glue sticks, just so it would save me some work. But they are expensive, and I'm a broke bitch. There we go. Let's see, this is not broken. Into the water you go. Yeah, no, that wasn't a good idea. Still too sticky. Too cute. Too so. Let me see if I can read that. Have you made something too cute to sell it? I usually sell everything I make. If I don't sell something, I usually, like, what I make, I don't to be something that's going to really stay with me unless it's like furniture or something, which I'm going to use. But my work is made for other people, and sometimes they just want to hang out with me for a while, and I have things that I've kept for a few months and sometimes a few years before, it's ready. They want to move on. It's time for them to go, and they're ready to go and find their forever home. Does that make sense? Kind of weird, but go. God, I'm hungry. I really should have had supper before coming down here tonight. There we go. A little bit wider than I want, but it's just gonna have to be the way it is. Stop sticking. I think a couple of years ago I made I make bats. I think the patterns from Beezy Art, and she makes some gorgeous things. And it was white with blue background and like pink and purple butterflies. It was a spring fabric, so it was like super cute. But I really liked it, so I put it upstairs and it went in my room on my shelf. And I think I had it for about 3 or 4 months, and then one day I got a message on Etsy, which I think I'm going to have to close my Etsy shop because Etsy changed their rules and I don't have a tax number because I'm under... Anyway, I think I'm going to have to close my Etsy shop. But they had messaged me, asked if I could make another bat like the one that I had sold on my shop. And I didn't have any more of that fabric, but I did have the bat on the shelf. And I think maybe that person was, whatchamacallit, was meant to have that little bat. And I was just meant to hold on to him until they got a hold of me to buy him. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so not sure about Etsy, but I think I'm going to have to get some other places hooked up for selling online. Come on, you fucker. All right. All right. Stick this in the back of the head where the brain's supposed to go. Just twinkle, twinkle, little star, but there's something off about it. Like there's a key missing, and it just makes it sound so wrong. I'm just gonna have the thread hanging off the back, so if they want to pull the eye, they can just kind of like hold it and pull without having... I mean, it'll probably be fine without it, but we overthink things, and that's why we're here. All right, where is it? I know it's not the best eyeball, but it's the only eyeball I have right now. Shit, 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 shit. No, we weren't supposed to get dirty. This was a bad idea. Can't get too much water because I can't afford to get the gears wet. Go. I'm just going to hold this until these set and then do them on the other side. That's all I can do. I'm going to paint this bitch. I'll get her done. You okay, little one? A little fuzzy on your butt. I think it'll be okay. I'm just going to put you way over to the side so you don't get any more damage than you are. There we go. Things are melting in there. Alright, let's see what's happening. The Lost Colony Roanoke. I've heard of this before, but we can listen to it for a bit.
About the open world. To explore a place you've never been before. The mystery of what lies ahead. Just
New World for wealth or opportunity, but rather because they faced a lot of persecution within England. Of course, France was just across the channel, but the only thing worse for an English Catholic than an English Protestant was a Frenchman. Gilbert set sail with 5 ships, one of which was actually captained by Sir Walter Raleigh, who is famously the namesake of the city of Raleigh. Unfortunately for him, his ship had to turn back due to a lack of supplies. When the fleet of 4 ships arrived in St. John's, Newfoundland, it was actually detained because they were being arrested for piracy against the Portuguese, but Gilbert wasn't really vibing with the idea of being detained in Newfoundland, so instead he captured the colony for England, which of course was the first overseas claim for what would become the British Empire. Unfortunately for Gilbert's expedition, they lacked the supplies to actually settle in Newfoundland, and the local Newfoundland population wasn't super happy with them, so they were forced to turn around and go back to England.
Just, getting
Gilbert
hot glue
made
on
some
everything, because
decisions
that's
that
how I
the
work.
rest of the sailors didn't quite like, such as sailing on one of the smallest ships. He also took a very poor course, and the result was that their supply ship, the Dorothy, was sunk, and most of their supplies lost. As well, a sea monster was sighted with the appearance of a lion and large glaring eyes. And like I said, Gilbert insisted on sailing on the worst possible ship of the fleet, the HMS Squirrel. Now, why was the Squirrel a problem? Well, according to, let me find it, the more experienced sailors, the captain, Edward Hayes, and the master, William Cox, it was overgunned and unsafe for sailing. What that meant is that the amount of cannon on the ship would likely lead to it tipping over in rough seas. Those rough seas came to pass on September 9th, 1583, at which point Gilbert was spotted not in his quarters, not below decks, not getting into a boat to try and get to one of the larger ships, but rather sitting on the stern reading in a storm. And in a moment that seems very cinematic for all of this, he shouted, "We are as near to heaven by sea as if by land." And then around midnight, the Squirrel went down with all hands, including him. Now, Gilbert's death did not preclude anybody from settling those lands. Instead, the charter simply transferred to his family members. One, an Adrian Gilbert, who was his brother, and Sir Walter Raleigh, his half-brother. Adrian was granted the right to settle all lands to the north of Newfoundland, which at the time they did not realize how little that was by comparison to what was south of Newfoundland, while Sir Walter Raleigh was granted everything south of Newfoundland to Florida. Of course, that included Spanish claims, which at this time we're starting to get towards a very famous incident in which a certain Spanish armada sailed towards England. So, there was no declared war, but Raleigh had no qualms about settling what was technically Spanish territory. And Walter Raleigh was a very, very important man in England. In fact, he held a number of very important offices in government. He held office as a member of Parliament for Devonshire, Dorset, and Cornwall, served as Lord Warden of the Stannaries, which were tin mines in Cornwall. He was Vice Admiral of Devon, Lord Lieutenant of Cornwall, Captain of the Yeomen of the Guard, and Governor of Jersey. This man was multitasking very hard. And for those of us who grew up in the 2000s, you might recognize a name here because he was married to one of the Queen's ladies in waiting. She wasn't happy about this. She didn't consent to this. She eventually forgave him. But he was married to one of the Queen's ladies in waiting, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Throckmorton. Raleigh's charter was granted on March 25th, 1584, and would expire in 1591. His orders were to, and I quote, "discover, search, find out, and view such remote, heathen, and barbarous lands to have, hold, occupy, and enjoy." Now, I should clarify what the term heathen means. It is not a term for somebody who is, especially at this time, somebody who is wild or feral or bad. Rather, it simply meant non-Christians. And that's something that you're going to see
which
as
is
we go into this story.
what they still consider
Words
it.
like
Anyway,
heathen and savage
today.
are used, but it seems that at the time they weren't completely derogatory in the sense that they are today, but they referred to people who were not Christians, who did not live in the European style. They refer to people as savages and then at the same time as their friends. So it's not a direct insult at the time. But one issue for Raleigh was that, unlike other explorers and colonists, he was never going to be able to govern his own colony. His commitments to Elizabeth I meant that he had to stay in England, or at the very least, wherever she told him he could go. One of those places he was not told he could go was North America. So he had to delegate it to more junior officers. So he sent 2 barks, which were mid-size merchant ships. They weren't quite the galleass style that you would see, but they were big enough to make a transatlantic voyage. Those barks were captained by Philip Amatus and Arthur Barlow. Now, Philip Amatus himself was a member of the merchant class, what would eventually develop into what we know as the middle class, but not quite the landed gentry, while being still above the working class. So he was an explorer, a naval commander, and a merchant. And on this mission, his pilot was a guy named Simon Fernandez, who will be very important throughout this entire story. Alternatively, very little is actually known about Arthur Barlow.
I got the
except for
music
the
box
fact
in
that
the
he is
head.
responsible for the
With the
earliest
pole
English
being
accounts of the New World.
an
He
eyeball.
was basically the first Englishman to write about America. Amadis and Barlow set sail from England and then reached what is now North Carolina on July 4th, 1584, which is a little ironic when you think about it. Amadis and Barlow made landfall at an inlet just north of Hatteras Island. Now,
And as the goes down, the eyeball gets pulled back up into the head. Very, very slowly.
Turkey Rage, 3 cheese, and BLT. Subway's new sandwiches are here.
Much better. Is that the Beatles?
What the hell?
Anything you can dream about here, you can make.
Who are you?
I am Steve. Okay.
This guy is such a tool bag.
Okay.
today, these islands have changed shape a little bit and merged and separated, but this island
that's
seems to
weird.
have been directly east of Roanoke.
I
The
think
fleet met
Jack
with two
Black is
tribes,
going to be the
particularly
next
the
Robin
Secatan
Williams.
and the Croatan. Croatan, of course, should be very familiar to you if you've ever heard anything about Roanoke's story, because it is the word that was carved onto a tree in the Lost Colony. They met with the chieftain of the Secatan's brother, Grand Ganymede. This was because the chieftain himself, Winganah, was actually injured. He had been wounded in battle against the Pamlico. The natives and the English got on reasonably well, and two Native Americans, a Secatan by the name of Juan Chese and a Croatan by the name of Manteo, actually went back to England with the explorers. Manteo was the son of the Croatan chieftain, and it does seem that
Ow.
Juan Chese was in some capacity related to the Secatan chieftain. Reports of the land and resources, as well as the amicability of the natives, were so good that it convinced Sir Walter Raleigh that Roanoke was a good place to actually make a settlement. And after
we go.
organizing the expedition, he was knighted by the
I
Queen,
do
going from being
need
Walter
some
Raleigh to
bones
Sir
on the
Walter
back,
Raleigh.
I think.
What you might not know about the Roanoke story, this grand lost colony narrative, is that the last colony of Roanoke was not the first colony of Roanoke. The first colony was more of a military expedition led by a man named Ralph Lane. The soldiers made good first waves for colonization because they were accustomed to discomfort, they were trained in combat, and they were typically also trained in other things like fort and trench digging. And most importantly, soldiers as opposed to civilians were considered a little more expendable. If you sent a whole bunch of civilians over and the colony failed and everybody died, it would be a lot harder to convince civilians to go again. Whereas with soldiers, it's a little bit, less of a challenge. Of course, that colonization practice goes back to the ancient Greeks, who would send entirely male colonies to far reaches of the Mediterranean and then later populate them with children. And Ralph Lane was very
wait, I have a leg.
colonization. He had been involved in several attempts in Ireland and had also served as a member of Parliament. Lane set off with a rather large colonization force. It was 600 men and 7 ships. Of course, the goal was that only 69 of them would remain, nice, but that eventually they would go on to reinforce and resupply the colony. The fleet was
So
led by
big,
now
though.
Admiral
Really just the whole
Philoppolis,
thing.
with Ralph Lane being the chosen governor, and Sir Richard Grenville being the actual leader of the expedition itself. And the flagship, a galleon
Might have to
named
give that a minute
Tiger,
and see what else
was
is there.
piloted once again by Simon Fernandez. Along with the actual
And maybe we'll
military
just leave it like
forces,
that.
a
Just
number
the
of
puppy with his eye
civilians
ripped
went
out.
along. There was John White, a very familiar
Alright,
name
we'll
for
put
anybody
that
who's
to
heard
the
this
side
story
for now,
before.
and work on the
Thomas
next one.
Harriot, who was a scientist, and Joachim Gauss, a metallurgist who was there to look into the possibility of
else?
gold,
Me
silver,
butcher.
copper, and other valuable resources,
Science.
who was also well known for being the first Jewish person in the North American continent. And of course, Manteo and Wanchese were returning. The fleet departed from Plymouth, Devon on April 9th, 1585. But rather quickly, the galleass Tiger became separated from the rest of the fleet, but they had a plan for this. Fernandez had ordered that if they were to be separated, all of the ships would meet up at Moscatel, which was also known as Mosquito Bay in Puerto Rico. Now, the storm that had separated the Tiger from the rest of the fleet had also sunk one of the much smaller pinnace ships. Now, these were usually two-masted little boats that could also be rowed in calmer waters or sail on the open sea. A brig was a type of pinnace, for example. Tiger arrived at Moscatel on May 11th, followed by Elizabeth, a ship that I could not determine the exact type, but it was likely also a galleass, arriving on the 19th. Grenville, at the time on board Tiger, managed to make a deal with the Spanish in Puerto Rico for supplies, and they began building some fortifications to protect themselves while they awaited the rest of the
the head will
fleet.
come off
But
this
the
one.
Spanish, despite agreeing, never actually delivered them, and Grenville became worried this meant that the Spanish were going to actually attack them,
I'm okay.
so they loaded up everything they had, got back on their ship, and set sail once again. It was not a total loss, because Grenville actually managed to capture 2 Spanish ships, as well as a Spanish salt mine on the way to the Outer Banks. He did, in fact, crave that mineral. He was the GOAT. Grenville then left Hispaniola en route for the Outer Banks on June 7th and arrived in North Carolina by June 26th. Roebuck, Red Lion, and Dorothy, the other remaining ships in the fleet, never actually went to Moscatel, instead heading straight for the Outer Banks and arriving there in mid-June. One thing about these expeditions is that they were often underfunded, and the sailors did not get paid ahead of time. Usually they got paid a little bit for the trip and then a percentage of whatever spoils came from that expedition. So a big problem that many of these early colonization efforts faced from all nations was the fact that it was often more profitable to go privateering, and they would very often lose ships to that. So Red Lion, for example, left 30 men on Croatoan Island and then headed north to Newfoundland to go privateering. Grenville's ship proceeded to rendezvous with Roebuck and Dorothy at Port Fernando, the inlet
Off
named
with the
after
head.
Simon Fernandez. And then on August 5th, John Arundel took one of the faster ships back to England to report on the situation. When they finally decided to set up the colony on Roanoke, they had lost some ships, they had lost a number of supplies, and did not have the capability to land all remaining 500 or so men there. Instead, they decided to leave 150 men on the island while the rest of the ships would return to England and retrieve supplies and then send a resupply fleet along with reinforcements later. That fleet was supposed to arrive in July or August, but unbeknownst to Grenville, because of Spanish activity in the area, the resupply fleet had been redirected all the way back to Newfoundland. So that forced the colonists to rely on friendly Native Americans until help arrived. And this is kind of where the trouble began. As well, the Tiger had sustained damage during its voyage in late June up to the Outer Banks, and Grenville, while well prepared, decided that he was going to explore Pamlico Sound to the south and see what there was there.
Just because it's getting cold outside doesn't mean you have to catch one. Get your daily dose of the Sunshine Vitamin with Immune Plus. Vitamin D and C, plus B vitamins and zinc. Get cold weather ready with Emergency Immune Plus.
Feels like a dream, feels like magic. Now I believe.
Alright, come on, where are you?
And Grenville, while it was repaired, decided that he was going to explore Pamlico Sound to the south
Alright, come on,
and
you
see what
fucker.
there was there. This gave John White and Thomas Harriot the opportunity to study the natives in depth. White was, of course, an artist and made many maps and depictions of the local people, while
Gotcha.
Harriot was a bit of a polymath. He was an astronomer, he was a navigator, he was an explorer, and he was, most importantly, an ethnographer. Of course, what Thomas Harriot is most known for is discovering the theory of refraction, which applies to light and not any of this other stuff. Unfortunately, much of Harriot and White's work didn't survive the expedition there or back, and the result was that we only really have their book that was published in 1588. Upon Grenville,
Come
White,
on.
and Harriet's return, it was
Furious.
discovered that a silver cup had gone missing from the colony,
Raging.
and for some reason it was believed that the natives had stolen it. Grenville then tasked Amatus with going and retrieving the cup, and Amatus did just about the worst thing you could possibly do in this situation, which was discover that the natives did not have the cup, accuse them of stealing it, and then when they still did not produce said cup, burning one of their villages to the ground.
Yeah, sounds
Somehow,
about right.
despite the razing of the village of Aquasoguk, The native Secretan people did not immediately become hostile towards the settlers. It definitely did rub the
Really
Secretan the
should've.
wrong way, but the unaffected Croatan were able to broker some sort of peace and eventually secure the rights to settle on Roanoke for the colonists. Roanoke was chosen specifically
What's that?
because it was in a good strategic position. It was inside of the Outer Banks. It was not one of the actual islands that make up that chain. Instead, it was well suited to avoid Spanish detection. When it came to these relationships and these negotiations, it wasn't the chieftain of the Secretan who was interacting with the English. It was his brother, Grand Ganameo, and Grand Ganameo became a rather pro-English voice in the chieftain's elder council. Upon receiving the territory of Roanoke, Richard Grenville ordered that a fort be built on the northern side of the island. Once everything was put together, he departed for England on board Tiger on the 25th of August. The Roebuck departed 2 weeks later on September 8th and left behind a pinnace, 107 men, and the commanders Philip Amatus and Governor Ralph Lane. Now, the presence of John White during this period of time, and again, John White will be extremely important to this story, his presence at this time is a matter of debate. Some people believe that he remained with the colony, some people that he returned home to England because his name is absent from the colonist list, the list of all of the names of the people left behind. This left 107 men behind to actually do the exploring and prospecting and figuring out, is this where we should keep the colony? Should we move further inland? What should we do? And they attempted to do that. One thing that they were really looking for, of course, was gold and silver or perhaps copper.
The live
Now,
stream.
these metals were nowhere near as valuable to the Native Americans as they were to the Europeans. There was some use of gold and silver by the natives, as well as copper, but they weren't smelting it. The North American Native Americans did not really have metalworking in the same sense that the Southern Americans did down in, for example, the Inca Empire. The natives of North America used a cold hammering technique to shape copper, whereas the Inca around 700 BC were actually beginning to smelt it. But unfortunately, no gold or silver were found anywhere in the area, and this made a lot of the colonists who came there hoping to acquire that stuff pretty disillusioned. They felt like it was a waste of a trip. After realizing that their efforts to find gold and silver were likely going to be fruitless, the colonists set about finding supplies for winter, and it appears that they were able to do so successfully enough to survive that same winter. Amatus would go on to use the very mild North Carolina winter to sail north and explore the Chesapeake area, where he spoke with the Algonquin-speaking Chesapeake Indians. The Secretan had described the Chesapeake town of Skikoke as the largest city in the region, and Amatus likely expected something along the lines of what was reported by the Spanish in places like the Aztec Empire or the Inca. Instead, he found something far more modest, and the fact that he would have expected something of the scale that you would find at Tenochtitlan, for example, suggests that the English really did not have a good grasp on the scale and size of America. I also do wonder if this might have anything to do with the tale of the Genosqua, I'm not sure which particularly it is, but we covered it in our video about Bigfoot and feral people and all of that. It's a Haudenosaunee legend of a stone-clothed giant from the south who, comes north and is cannibalistic and all that. And I wonder if this has something to do with the English settlers coming with their steel armor and being unable to be harmed by stone axes and arrows. And of course, the legend could have passed to the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, from the Chesapeake and the Algonquin-speaking people, who of course also had their own stories of, you guessed it, the Wendigo. So it seems possible to me that the stone skin and the cannibalism come from two separate legends that merged into one. The Iroquois/Haudenosaunee peoples actually would end up driving a lot of the Algonquin speakers out of their native lands down south and to the east and to the north, and that could be how they arrived at this story of steel-skinned people. Not from encountering them themselves, but hearing about them from the Chesapeake and the Powhatan. I say that because the Iroquois may have never actually encountered these stone-skinned people, but rather when they were driving the Algonquin-speaking Lenape from their lands in Pennsylvania, they may have heard about these invaders from the south. As Amatus and his crew traveled around, they did start to notice something, or more particularly Thomas Harriot, the scientist on the expedition, began to notice something. And that was that every single village they visited was almost immediately beset by a sort of plague, some sort of epidemic that killed off a large number of the Native Americans. Now, despite having pattern recognition, they could not pinpoint why, and that's because germ theory was still 300 years away. They didn't know what was doing this to people. It was probably smallpox. But at the time, they did not know what caused sickness. It was believed that there were evil spirits or that the air was somehow polluted in some way by something they called the miasma, and that
Dear Sam, I know you're little now, and these memories may become fuzzy, but there are a few things I want you to always remember. I hope that, no matter how old you get and how big you grow, you always believe in magic. Nothing is too out of reach for you. You're so curious, Sam. I hope you always keep that curiosity for life. Try new things and keep an open mind. You might just surprise yourself. Maybe even defend an entire galaxy. Or make an unexpected friend. The whole world is at your fingertips. You can go everywhere. Travel the world. But always remember where you come from. Never stop being an explorer. Make the impossible possible. Be brave and adventurous. Sometimes the best things in life are a little scary.
and that when you went near a rotten corpse, it wasn't the bacteria that were going to cause you to get sick. It was some sort of air. Now, of course, this is not what that actually is. We know that now, but how are they going to know that then? It's not great anytime you get a whole bunch of new people sick, but it got worse because Chieftain Wingana also got sick, and his native shamans and healers did everything they could to make him better. But it wasn't until the Christians came, the English, and sat with him and prayed for him that he got better, that he recovered. And they did something that was definitely rational for them, but is not rational in hindsight, which is they said, oh, well, when the English came and prayed, he got better. So let's send the English around to pray for all the sick people in the other villages. Problem was, it wasn't prayer that made him better, it was luck. And all of the other Native Americans who then had the English praying for them ended up dying. So great example of good intentions, bad outcome. And another unforeseen consequence of this decision to go around praying for everybody and these interactions, these more and more common interactions between English and Native, was that the amount of men in the settlement available to harvest was much lower. So the food crop yield that winter, that fall, was not what it needed to be for just the Secatan, let alone the English who were relying on them for food. That lack of food led to a general distrust between the natives and the English, who both felt that the situation was tenuous and their survival kind of depended on the other side maybe not doing so great. On top of all of that, Granganameo, the chieftain's brother, who was very pro-English, died that winter, which left things even worse because now there weren't really any strong voices in the Secatan tribe speaking on behalf of the colonists. Wingana, being very suspicious of the English colonists in the area, changed his name to Pemisipan, which means one who watches. Eventually, realizing that the situation was untenable, Ralph Lane went to Pemisipan and asked him if he had any thoughts about the English going further inland towards Chowanoke territory. And Pemisipan decided to play a little fun game and thought, you know what, maybe I can get rid of my rival without raising my axe. So Pemisipan told Ralph Lane that there was an alliance of inland natives who hadn't even met the colonists yet, who were organizing an alliance to go in and destroy the Roanoke colony, and that they were led by a Chowanoke leader named Menetani. This native alliance allegedly numbered 3,000 men to Ralph Lane's 107. Lane, not wanting to be in a situation where he had to defend his fort against so many men, took a well-armed force inland, hoping to surprise the Chowanoke force. Now, this was really their only option. You might think of, for example, the movie Zulu, where a bunch of British soldiers with muskets and all of that managed to fend off a much larger army of Africans, But this was not the same circumstance. Typical narratives about the American colonization period are inextricably tied to a weapon called the musket, but the musket of 1585 was very different from the musket of 1700. Instead of being a handheld weapon, it was more like a small cannon. You would often take a mount made out of steel, pop the barrel onto that mount, and then hold the gun up to your shoulder and fire it. It was not the simple, line fire technique. There was a lot more that went into it. So at the time, this was not super different from the late medieval arquebus. And when compared with the Brown Bess musket used by the British during the colonial period, these were heavier, they were longer, they were less accurate, and they were more prone to misfires. 107 of these would, at best, take out 107 of those 3,000 natives, and then you'd have the remaining 2,900 or so after you. What we're talking about here is a firearm that would have been about 4 feet long and would have weighed over 10 pounds. Compare that to a modern carbine, and you're looking at something that weighs 6 to 7 pounds and is considerably shorter. So colonists at Roanoke would have more likely been relying on their pikes and their swords, and there's been suggestions that maybe they had longbows or crossbows, but nothing has really been found to confirm that. If they had used those weapons, it's likely we would have found steel arrowheads. So when Lane's force arrived to hopefully surprise the Chalonoke and rout them before a battle could happen, what they found was a council that was meeting, but definitely not prepared for battle. So, without much effort, they managed to capture Menetonnen as well as his son and force them to negotiate. However, when speaking with Menetonnen, they discovered something very interesting. He thought that they were planning to attack him, and that's why he had called this whole war council. And who had given him the information that the colonists were planning to attack his people? Temisipan, who set up the entire thing hoping to get rid of both the rival to his east as well as the rival to his west. Menetonnen also told Ralph Lane about a very wealthy and powerful kingdom to the northeast, likely the Powhatan Confederacy, and said that if he were to venture into that territory, he should go very heavily armed. You might be familiar with Powhatan because of the story of Pocahontas and John Smith. Menetonnen himself was ransomed back to his people, but in typical European custom of the time, his son, Skiko, was actually taken as a hostage. Hostage, of course, did not mean somebody who was kept tied up in a dungeon somewhere. They were typically kept within the main household of the governor or the lord or the king, and they were treated with a great deal of respect and given enough leisure to enjoy themselves and not feel trapped, but they weren't quite given the freedom to roam. Skiko told Lane about a place called Chalmis Temoatan, which was a source of valuable metal.
Now for Sunday clothes and nothing fancy, I have decided to share my employee discount with you!
Take 20% off the lowest price on all mattresses, folks. Sale price on this double, take 20% off, you pay $280. Queen size, take 20% off the sale price, you pay $320, folks. Come compressed in bulk, JC will load it for you. Sales on through Sunday at close.
That's right, 1 year, no interest, no payments, financing throughout the store. All 7 locations, nothing fancy, since Sunday.
Sofa with pop-up bed in stores, 20% off, you pay $720.
Getting that yes to credit felt like finally moving in the direction that I
Those are the ones that want.
With Capital One, I've been able to rebuild my credit. Some other doors that the yes opened for me was Wilton. Take my family and friends to dinner without having to worry about it. It allows me to do things in life that I want to do. To have stability for me mentally. And makes life so much more enjoyable. That yes to credit was just the beginning for me.
This was all very good information because Lane was realizing how bad the situation with the Secatan was getting. It had gone from distrust to Temisipan actually tried to have him murdered, basically. So he planned to split his colony into 2. One would head up the Chowan River towards Chalonoke territory and to explore looking for this source of gold or copper, and the other would go up north into the Chesapeake, hoping to settle up there where things were a little bit less tense. However, that meant that they needed to wait on Roanoke for supplies to arrive so that they could, of course, have the things they needed to go and attempt this, as well as send to England about where they were going. Those supplies were not going to arrive until around Easter, and it was still mid-March. Easter, of course, that year was April 6th. Lane himself, realizing that he had time until all of this came to pass, decided that he would send Skiko and a number of men back to Roanoke, and then he and 40 chosen men would head west along the Roanoke River looking for gold or copper. Lane had hoped to sustain this 100-mile expedition by trading with the Moratuk and other peoples along the way. However, Pemisipan had told all of them that the English were hostile. So every time they got to a village, they found that it was completely empty and the natives were hiding somewhere in the trees, or worse, they ambushed them. Despite all of this, Lane's men did manage to make it back half-starved to Roanoke by just after Easter, surprising Pemisipan so much that he decided to maybe change his strategy. An aspect of Pemisipan's decision to change his strategy with the English may have come from another Native American, part of the Secatan tribe, an elder named, I'm going to try to get this, Ensenor, or Ensenore, and he argued in favor of the colonists. Around the same time, messengers from Menetonin got there and told Lane that members of the Wepameok tribe had pledged fealty to Queen Elizabeth I. This meant that Pemisipan was very quickly losing all of his advantages. However, the reprieve from hostilities was very short-lived because Ensenore passed away on April 20th, 1586, leaving basically no one in the Secatan camp to speak on behalf of and argue in favor of keeping good relations with the English. Things were pushed further along by Juan Chebe, who had decided, based on his time with the English, that they were in fact a very real threat, and it was better to get rid of them than to try and work with them. Pemisipan, who had actually ordered infrastructure built on Roanoke to help supply the colonists, ended up abandoning the colony, ordering an evacuation, leaving behind only a small force of warriors to hold their claim to the island, and then just left the English there. And worse, he actually had all of that infrastructure he had built destroyed, which was absolutely catastrophic for the colony. And this is where one of those Native Americans becomes very important to the English side. Skiko, the son of Menetonin, was playing the role of double agent, and the person being fooled was, of course, Pemisipan. Skiko was loyal to his father, and his father was loyal to the English. So that meant that if Pemisipan was trying to hurt the English, Skiko was going to go and tell Ralph Lane. And he played his part so well that he actually convinced Pemisipan that he was well on the anti-English side, strongly enough that Pemisipan told him about a plan he had hatched to get rid of the English. You see, the English had been trading copper to the Native Americans, the Secatan and Croatan, in exchange for supplies. Pemisipan had taken that copper and gone to other Native American tribes and offered it to them in exchange for helping him defeat the English. He had called a war council, which was planned for June 10th, and Lane decided to get ahead of it after being told by Skiko.
I'm going to get some 3D horns printed, so these will be upgraded.
Before they were fully ready for their attack. So he came up with a simple little lie. He told Pemisipan that an English fleet had arrived offshore with supplies and men and all of that, and this made it so that the Secatan had to move now. Pemisipan moved his council up to the 31st of May, and they met at a place called, I'm going to try so hard, Dasamongaponke, just across the water from Roanoke on the west, on the mainland. According to Skiko, Pemisipan's plan was to have a small contingent of Secatan warriors sneak into the fort and kill Amadas and Lane and all of the commanders, and then the next day a larger force would come across the water and kill whoever was left. Skiko, of course, told Lane about all of this, and rather than just waiting for it to happen, Ralph Lane organized his own attack on those remaining warriors on Roanoke, killing or capturing them, and then planning to go over to the mainland the next day. Of course, the next morning, Lane, his lieutenants, and 25 picked men sailed across the bay and introduced themselves over to Pemisipan and said, hey, last night, some people tried to free Skiko, and we really want to talk to you about that. This whole hostage situation, you know, this is important.
What the hell?
They were admitting to the council. Of course, they had just lied. They had suggested that they misunderstood the ambush, that they thought that that was not the Secatan, but rather perhaps the Chalonoke trying to free the hostage son of the chieftain. So, Pemisipan, thinking that, you know what, he had this in the bag, he was fine, nobody knew what was going on yet, totally clear, he lets them into the council, at which point Lane's men promptly open fire with pistols and draw their swords.
What is this
Pemisipan
stuff?
himself is shot and flees into the woods.
Where did it go?
But the English
Shut up for a minute!
cut off his...
What did I touch? What did I touch? Because I don't know where this black... Is it off of... Oh my god, it is. The fuck is this shit? I was wiping on myself. I don't know what it is. Does the bear have liquid eyes? I don't know what this stuff is. I don't know what it is. It smells like oil? Nope, you're going right in the garbage. I have no idea. Is that oil paint? Oh, it smells like gasoline. What the fuck? Nope. Nope. Vintage is in the garbage. I am not touching that shit. Although I just did, but I'm not touching it anymore. What else can I work on tonight? How about you? I gotta go wash my hands. I'm gonna be right back. The fuck was that? Still smell it. I have no idea what that thing was. What that shit is, but I'm not fucking with it. Okay, you're adorable. How can we fuck this up? Eyes, fangs.
And bring it back to Ralph Lane. Wanting to send a message about, lying to him, Ralph Lane placed Pimsapon's head on a pike outside of the fort. However, despite this victory, he still knew the position was untenable and something had to change. By a stroke of luck, at least to them, Sir Francis Drake's fleet arrived from the Caribbean just offshore, knowing the Roanoke colony was there and wanting to check in on them. Drake had plenty of supplies and was in the
architecture
in the upper echelon of English society, and knew that if he dropped off some supplies for the Roanoke colonists, it would put him in very well with Sir Walter Raleigh and by extension Queen Elizabeth I. Drake left the colonists a ship, the Francis, and then proceeded to plan to head back to England. However, the Francis was swept out to sea by a hurricane, they had to tow it back in, and during the course of all of this, Lane convinced Francis Drake to bring all of them back to England because they were really just in a bad spot, and a few months' supplies probably wasn't going to do it for them. A couple of members of the Croatan also went home to England with Drake and Lane, namely Manteo and one of his friends. One interesting aspect here is that the Croatan may have felt comfortable amongst the English because of some particular religious traits. According to Thomas Harriot, the Croatan believed in one great creator god who has existed since before time, who created a number of lesser divinities to rule over the world with him. And that may sound familiar to you because it's basically Deuteronomy 32:8 and Genesis. They also believed in an immortal soul and a binary afterlife where you either go to a heavenly paradise to live amongst the gods, or you go to a place called Papagusso, which is to the west by the setting sun, where you burn in a fiery pit for all of eternity. Leading this religion were, of course, priests who were educated wise men and were considered to be the elder leadership position, as well as, of course, conjurers. And what did conjurers do? Well, they had supernatural powers gifted to them by God. So if you're catching on, those are some stunning parallels to Abrahamic religion, and that actually opens up a lot more questions than it answers, but it does explain why the Croatan and the English were able to be so friendly with each other. The English probably looked at that religion and went, oh, these guys are going to be really easy to convert. Now, alternatively to the people that left, 3 colonists actually did decide to stay behind for unknown reasons. Perhaps they had fallen in love with a woman of the colony, or they had committed crimes back in England, who really knows. But they decided to stay behind, and none of them were ever seen again. As far as Drake's side of things goes, he had prisoners and refugees and slaves on board, and we don't know what happened to any of them. He can't have brought the slaves back to England because slavery was illegal on the Isle of Britain itself, but he also does not appear to have recorded leaving them there, so we don't know what happened to those people. Following their departure from Roanoke, the returning colonists arrived in England in July of 1586 and introduced the Isle to corn, tobacco, and potatoes. In a great turn of irony, just a few days after the abandonment of the colony, Richard Grenville's supply ships arrived with 400 men and a year's worth of supplies. Grenville proceeded to interrogate the natives to figure out what happened to his colony, not knowing that he had simply left with Francis Drake when he got there, and was told about the fighting between the Secretan and the colonists, and the whole thing with Menetanen and the Croatan, and all of that, and he proceeded to decide that, you know what, 107 men, there's no way they could hold this fort. You know who could? 15. So he left just 15 men to guard his fort, which implies that either the Croatan told him less than I would assume they did, and did not inform him about the whole thing with the Secretan, or Grenville just didn't care. You know, maybe he just didn't understand the severity of the situation. And so the first attempt at settlement of the colony at Roanoke was a complete unmitigated failure, except for the part where they got to bring corn, tobacco, and potatoes back. Upon the return of Lane's colonists, Walter Raleigh was pretty disappointed, but White and Harriet managed to convince him that all was not lost and it was worth sending another expedition. On January 7th, 1587, Sir Walter Raleigh granted a charter to John White, allowing him to found the city of Raleigh in what was then called Virginia, the territory that Walter Raleigh named after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I, which is of course not to be confused with the Chad Queen Mary of Scots. This time around, John White was named governor of the colony and took with him 115 colonists, but this time they took a different approach. Considering that last time it was a military expedition led by military men, they wondered if perhaps they would have better luck running through this with civilians who weren't going to respond to things in quite the same shoot first, ask questions later manner that Amatus had responded to the missing silver cup. And White had a very personal stake in this colony. He wasn't just leading a bunch of volunteers. Among them were his own daughter, Elizabeth Dare, and her husband, Ananias Dare. And Elizabeth was pregnant. And rounding out this colony, 2 Native Americans from the Croatan tribe, Manteo and I believe this is pronounced Tawai. And with this crew, it was mostly middle-class English people. They weren't lower class, they weren't working class looking for a brand new life. They were people who were just under that upper echelon of society who thought that by going to the Americas and becoming landowners, they could then earn the rights of the landed gentry back in England. So on May 8, 1587, 3 ships departed from Plymouth, Devon. The fleet consisted of a galleass, one of the larger war and merchant ships of the time, as well as a flyboat, which is a small Dutch design, and once again a pinnace. And for the 3rd time, Simon Fernandez was the pilot on the lead ship. In this case, it was the Lion. One very interesting part of the story that doesn't often get explained properly is the fact that they did not intend to go back to Roanoke. They knew how bad the situation at Roanoke was, and instead they planned to settle somewhere in the Chesapeake Bay area. But the goal was to stop by Roanoke first, speak to their Croatan friends, drop off Manteo and Tawai, and pick up or at least consult with the 15 colonists left by Grenville. And another main reason that they were so interested in colonizing wasn't because they understood the riches of the United States as it would become, or Canada. It was because
only the one who has earned the people's support is fit to be king.
Just put the snout in there. Kind of just put the snout. Hey, tonight. Just working on some monsters.
Canadian Tire has all your do-it-yourself jobs covered. For tools, hardware,
it's mine
paint,
operation.
and more.
Best, don't worry.
Get started at Canada's store.
riches of the United States as it would become, or Canada. It was because they still thought that the Pacific was just on the other side. A man, a priest and a writer by the name of Hakluyt from Britain, I believe his first name was Richard, was very invested. He was one of the people who was behind pushing and lobbying for that very first expedition in 1578 when the first charter was granted. He was the guy who was making all of these pushes, and he convinced them to go to the Chesapeake Bay, thinking the Pacific's just on the other side, this is just a waypoint, this is just a stopping post for us to resupply, get ready, and then move on to the Pacific so they could get to the East Indies. And as you would expect from all of these trips, the very, very first thing to happen was that they ran into some trouble and had to leave behind the flyboat. But Simon Fernandez was the one who made that decision, not anybody else in charge. Now, they could have waited, but it seems that he decided, against the wishes of some of the other leaders, to leave that boat behind. So, Captain Edward Spicer's ship would not arrive at the same time as the others. After what was likely a pretty grueling sea voyage, keep in mind this was the 1500s, they did arrive at Roanoke on July 22nd, 1587, after what was probably a rather grueling sea voyage, considering that these people were in the 1500s.
You just repeated yourself twice.
Croatoan Island, and they anchored off of it. They did not go ashore immediately. White's plan was to take the pinnace and go ashore on Roanoke with about 40 men. However, details around what actually happened here are a little fuzzy, and it seems that Simon Fernandez, upon White getting onto the pinnace, changed the orders and told them that they were going to Roanoke and they were staying at Roanoke. He did not plan to take them on to the Chesapeake. He was going to drop everybody at Roanoke and then go home. His reasoning, apparently, was that it was too late in the summer to start sailing around the Chesapeake trying to figure out where they were actually going to end up. Maybe this trip took longer than they expected, but it seems a little odd. When all of the colonists were dropped off on Roanoke, they discovered a rather strange scene. The fort that had been left behind by the last colony and protected by those 15 soldiers left behind by Grenville had been mostly dismantled. It was overgrown. There were melons everywhere. And yeah, that's a real detail. And the only evidence that humans had been there anytime recently was a single skeleton. And if you think things got off to a bad start with the last colony, this one went downhill even faster. Just days into being at Roanoke, perhaps even the same day, there's not a ton of detail on it that I could find, the colonists were attacked. A guy named George Howe was out in the bay trying to crab and, hunt for some food when he was shot numerous times by what were probably the Secatan. Upon being informed of this, White, who was trying to avoid a repeat of the 1585 colony, decided not to immediately retaliate. He sent one of his captains, an Edward Stafford, to Croatoan Island, where he learned from the local people, with the help of Manteo, that the other Native American man, Wanchese, who had been brought back to England with the expedition from 1584, had led a raiding party to attack Grenville's fort. Apparently what had happened was that 2 of the soldiers were caught unawares and both of them were killed. 4 more who were with them managed to escape, and the remaining ones had not been on the boat and went and picked those guys out of the water, and then none of those 13 people were ever seen again. On behalf of the new colonists, the Croatians tried to broker a peace agreement, some sort of treaty or a truce between the colonists and the Secatan, but the Secatan did not respond to any of the Croatoan offers. Seeing no other option, because they couldn't move the colony, White ordered a preemptive attack on Dasamangwapanki on August 9th. So they were going to go over and just lightning strike, try and drive out the rivals. The problem was the Secatan, having murdered George Howe, anticipated this and withdrew from the village. When White arrived, he saw a whole bunch of Native Americans picking around, and they immediately attacked, thinking it was the Secatan. But after a couple of them ran up with, their hands waving in the air, telling them that they were friendly, they realized that these were actually Croatan looters who had moved into the village, and they had accidentally attacked their friends. To the colonists' credit, even Manteo was fooled. He didn't know, and he felt terrible, and he did tell the Croatan, okay, this was kind of your fault. Like, you shouldn't have done this. Let's not fight. Now, had it been any other member of the tribe, it might have been very difficult to broker a peace there. However, Manteo, being the son of the chieftain, was able to get his mother, the actual chieftain, to smooth everything over and make sure that things were friendly between the colonists and the Croatan. Very grateful to Manteo, the English named him Lord of Dasamangwapanki and Roanoke. Things have been pretty rough, but there was a very happy moment when, on August 18th, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English woman born in the colonies. But by this time, it was quite clear to everybody that, a little bit of good news wasn't enough. They were going to need actual help from the English. By August 21st, the 2 remaining ships were ready to leave for England to resupply and inform about what was going on, but they were not able to leave because of a storm. This gave the colonists time to decide, okay, who are we actually sending back to England? White wanted to send 2 of his assistants, his lieutenants, but nobody wanted to go. The one person who did volunteer to go out of the 12, everybody else told him he couldn't because they didn't think he was, up to it. And so they spent several days, at first just his assistants, trying to convince White, who had the most status and the most pull, to be the one to go back to England. Of course, White wanted to stay there. His daughter had just given birth. And he was concerned that if he went back, everybody would look at him as though he had abandoned the colony, or he didn't trust that it was doing well, and that it would hurt his reputation, and possibly backfire in their attempts to get help. But after literally the entire colony asked him to go, he finally...
There's something really magical about the open road. To explore a place you've never been before. The mystery of what lies ahead. Just you, your road trip partner, the radio, a full tank of gas, and some...
caved and agreed that,
I don't care. When you get to a certain age, you've heard it all before. You've heard all the stories. Maybe something I haven't heard before. Let's try this one.
Before any of you get angry, Wendigoon basically told us to do this. I'm Aiden Madison. Welcome back to the Lore Lounge. Northern California, while a very beautiful region of the United States, is kind of a hotspot for just genuine strangeness. The region is home to the shadowy Bohemian Grove, played host to the People's Temple cult, and was the site of the infamous Donner Party encampment. And in the year 1978, it was the scene of one of America's most enduring mysteries, colloquially known as the Yuba County Five. On February 24th of that year, Gary Mathias, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, Ted Wire, and Jack Madruga, all men between the ages of 24 and 32 with mild intellectual disabilities, simply vanished without a trace. Before moving any further with the story, it's probably important to define exactly what mild intellectual disability means, because it is a newer term that replaced an archaic term for mental disabilities, specifically lower IQs. The old term was mental retardation. Obviously, this has been phased out and replaced with intellectual disability. Mild intellectual disability is defined now in the DSM-5 as having an IQ between 50 and 69. And while a lot of the reporting at the time refers to all 5 members of the group as being, bear with me, because I'm just telling you what the reporting says, refers to them as being 5 mildly retarded individuals. They weren't. In fact, only 3 of them had mild intellectual disabilities. That was Ted Wire, Jack Madruga, and Bill Sterling. Now, Jack Hewitt, on the other hand, was a little bit more severe. His IQ was somewhere in the 40s, whereas Gary Mathias was actually of perfectly average intelligence. But he did suffer from paranoid schizophrenia. I'll go into some more details about all of that later, but I just wanted to get that out of the way at the beginning of the video for anybody who might be confused as to what these exact terms mean. Also, one other little thing is that while these were all grown men, due to a 1978 article, they are commonly referred to as the boys. So we're probably going to be using that terminology throughout this video. All of that said,
I've heard this one before, but I did not realize they were actually grown men.
To a basketball game in nearby Chico, California, about 46 miles north of their homes in Yuba City and nearby Marysville. They were driven there by 30-year-old Jack Madruga, who had served in the Army as a truck driver from 1966 to 1968, so that they could see the California State University Chico, I want to say, Wildcats, play against the UC Davis Aggies. Also, because it is the colloquial name for the school, we're just going to refer to that as Chico State, because California State University Chico is a lot to say. By all accounts, the boys made it to the game, had a great time, and then stopped at a convenience store afterwards. However, that night, they did not return home, despite the fact that they were expected to play in a basketball tournament in Rocklin, California, at 8 a.m. the next night. It launched a pretty significant search, because these were 5 young men who, on their own, were going to struggle to survive if they were missing somewhere in the wild. A couple days into that search, their car, a 1969 Mercury Montego in turquoise and white, was located up in Plumas National Forest, which is to the northeast of both Yuba City and Chico. The thing is, not a single one of the men was in the car. Absolutely no trace of where they'd gone. And the question, where did they go, is inextricably tied to the location in which the car was discovered. Again, Plumas National Forest, which is a 1.146 million acre wilderness preserve straddling parts of Plumas, Yuba, Butte, Sierra, and Lassen County. Now, if you've been watching Lore Lodge videos for a little while, you know what's coming, but if you're new, then I should inform you that right about here in most of our videos, we input a little history segment on the region in which the story happened. This usually deals primarily with the Native American inhabitants before the settler period, although sometimes we'll go into a little bit more detail about that as well. If you are not at all interested in learning about the history of the region, that is perfectly fine. We don't judge you for it, and we understand, and we suggest that you just skip to the next chapter of the video. And if you're catching this as a premiere, then just be forewarned, this is a long one. The whole video is a long one. The history segment's actually quite short, but the video is very long because there are so many things that happened, and so many pages of notes, which took me so many hours to write down, partially because I, refused to ask for help. But what really helped me get through all of it was the chair I am currently sitting in. This chair is the FlexiSpot C7, and we've actually been partnering with FlexiSpot for a very long time, and that's why we are bringing them to you in this video. FlexiSpot offers a wide range of office products, and we actually have one of their desks as well. It is a standing desk, the E7. I actually love it. It's fantastic. It's got slots for me to put in power strips. It's got drawers. It's a powered standing desk, so it goes up and down just at the press of a button. And this guy right here is awesome because I have back problems and the lumbar and neck support are just first class. I'm going to be honest with you guys, up until I got this bad boy, I was kind of working with just hand-me-down chairs that I got from my stepdad, my dad, friends who were moving on to something nicer because they had big boy finance jobs, things like that. Those chairs wreaked havoc on my back, which was already a bad back because I slept on a couch through most of college, but that's a story for another time. What I really love about this chair, though, I've got to say, is the lumbar support. Every time I move, no matter how subtle the change is, the chair actually adapts to the way I've shifted position. These chairs are also designed for a wide range of body types, anybody from heights of 5'4" to 6'2", with hip width of 21 inches and shoulder width of 26. The chair can also recline, and the armrests are adjustable side to side, forward and back.
Only on Paramount Plus. Stream all 3 Quiet Place movies.
Armrests are adjustable side to side, forward and back, up and down. It's basically an all-purpose chair. I can sit cross-legged, I can have one leg up, I can have both legs on the floor, I can even recline and lay down in this thing. And as you can see, I do have the mesh version, but it comes in foam as well. Honestly, I cannot recommend this product enough. I use it myself every day of my life, and if you are working in an office setting, IT, freelancing, or just even playing video games, it's going to be comfortable, it's going to feel good on your back, and you're going to go to sleep each night feeling like you did not sit on a metal chair all day. If you'd like to give the C7 or any of the other FlexiSpot line of products a try, then you can use the code C730 to get $30 off your order today. Just go to the link in our description, place the C7 into your cart, enter the code C730,
welcome to the live stream.
and you will receive $30 off.
Just working on
and
some
now that we have finished the chair, I'm going to learn you a thing or two about the Maidu people. The Maidu people were a group indigenous to the Yuba River area. That includes towns like Chico, Yuba City, and up into the Sierra Nevada mountains. Yuba County and the Yuba River, and of course by extension Yuba City, are all actually named after a Maidu word. More specifically, a village that was called Yuba. There were several different groups that comprised the Maidu, and all of them spoke languages of the Maidu language family, but these were not mutually intelligible, and while they shared sounds, they had grammatical differences that made it so people couldn't necessarily understand what they were saying conversationally. These languages included the Maidu proper language, as well as Chico, Concow, and Nisenan. And the Maidu language family itself may be part of a larger language
I'm not
family.
gonna put any eyes on it. I don't think I want eyes on this one.
If this language
I think I'm
family
gonna
does
stick the wings
exist
on
and all
though,
of these
just for
are
a little
connected,
extra
then the
something.
Maidu language would be part of the same genetic grouping as most of the mountain languages going up the Cascades and Sierras. Right now, however, the Penutian language family is simply proposed and not yet proven. In relation to their linguistic divisions, the Maidu were also broken into 3 primary subcategories. These were the Nisenan, the Concow, and the Mountain Maidu. Within these subcategories, the Maidu typically lived in small communities, not usually larger than a band. So we're talking extended family groupings of between a dozen and 100 people. There's not a ton of concrete information on the Maidu available, and what we do have often sticks to one specific group of them, so it's hard to say what the overall culture was, but looking, for example, at the Nisenan, we can learn a few things about their marriage practices. The Maidu were a patriarchal, patrilineal, and patrilocal society, which meant that a parent would choose a spouse for their child, and the female spouse would move in with the male spouse's band. They would go and become part of that group. As for who ran the society, it was the men, but specifically, it was people from the religious leadership, and this was a religion called Kuksu. And Kuksu ceremonies, which typically involved dances to bring good fortune, rain, a bountiful harvest, whatever they needed at the time, were performed in secret underground chambers by a secret society that was entirely male. It was from amongst this secret society that leaders of the various bands would be chosen, but their authority was pretty limited. It wasn't sort of like you would think of
these are the wrong side.
It
What
was
the hell?
instead that they were kind of mediators within the community, and they would help settle disputes between one band and another. Part of the reason that there wasn't a centralized authority system is that the Maidu were hunter-gatherers. They were semi-nomadic. They would move from place to place with the game and the foods that they needed to harvest. So this meant that you didn't really have the concrete territories to fight over. You more just had hunting grounds that were reserved to one band or another, and if you had a conflict, then they would try and work it out diplomatically rather than fighting. As far as what they would hunt and gather, it was typically game meat. We're talking about elk, deer, things like that. And then they ate a lot of acorns. This seems to have been a staple part of their diet. So what they would do is they would pound the acorns into a meal. They would lay them out onto a mat. They would cover them with cedar or fir boughs, and then they would pour water over it to hydrate. This process would begin by putting the acorn into a mortar that would actually be fashioned out of a hole in the ground. They would grind out a hole in the bedrock, stick the acorns in there, and then use a pestle to grind it into the meal. Once the process was completed, this food could be stored or eaten fresh. As I mentioned, they were semi-nomadic.
Actually, that's not. It's got too many tannins, so it has to be rinsed and soaked and boiled quite a few times.
They would go somewhere where the food was plentiful, and they would set up little homes. They would build these warm weather homes using a pole and frame structure, and then wrapping bark around it. Typically, you would see oak bark used for the roof, and then when it came to their winter homes, those were a little bit more standardized. Those were a little bit more permanent. They would dig 3 foot deep, about 12 to 18 foot wide pits into the ground, and then they would build their homes into those pits. Basically, around the side of the pit, they would put up this frame structure, they would coat it with pine bark on the outside, and they would build a fire pit right in the middle. And one very recognizable trait of the Maidu was that they were very skilled weavers. They would create baskets for storage that ranged from anywhere from a very small little basket up to something quite large for storing large amounts of food, blankets, whatever. I mean, these baskets could often be like a dozen feet wide. And if you go online and you look at some pictures, they had these really cool ornate designs that clearly took a lot of skill and craftsmanship. Now, we don't know a ton about Maidu history before the arrival of settlers in around the late 1700s. And in 1770, it's estimated that the Maidu population was around 9,500 people. Unfortunately, an 1833 malaria epidemic wiped out a significant portion of the population, and from there it continued to fall for a very long time, and precipitously. That's because disease was only one factor of this decline. The other was that as the gold rush took hold, you had thousands upon thousands of settlers moving into the area who...
I like it. It's mine. The prices blow my mind. I feel so rich. I feel like a billionaire. I'm shopping like a billionaire. I'm shopping like a billionaire. I'm shopping like a billionaire. I get it straight from the makers. I'm shopping like a billionaire.
Download the Temu app and shop like a billionaire.
Thousands of settlers moving into the area who, even if they weren't fighting with the Maidu openly, did have to compete with them for resources, food, water, and this became a situation where if you didn't migrate, then you were likely going to starve. Unfortunately, the migration terms offered were not great. They offered these people a very small settlement, a reservation in Mendocino County, and if they didn't go to it, then they were either killed or forcibly removed by California militias like Captain John Fremont's Mariposa Brigade. As a result of all of these policies and the rather violent actions of the California militias, the Maidu population fell to just 93 people by the year 1930. However, since then, it's been able to rebound and now sits around 2,500. It was that former Maidu territory that became Yuba County, one of the first official American counties in California when it was admitted into the Union in 1850. Today, Yuba County covers about 644 square miles along the western slopes of the northern Sierra Nevada mountains. It sits due south of Butte County and to the southwest of Plumas County, which of course was where Plumas National Forest is, and where the Yuba County Five's 1969 Mercury Montego was found. The Yuba County Five, once again, that is Gary Mathias, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, Ted Wire, and Jack Madruga, were all united by two main things. One was the fact that they were intellectually disabled, or in the case of Gary Mathias, had schizophrenia, and the other was a love of basketball. Gary is probably the most significant and most interesting character of the bunch, so we're going to start with him. He was a 25-year-old Army veteran, and at the time, because he had schizophrenia, even though it was very well managed, he was living with his parents in Marysville. When he was in the army in the early 1970s, he was stationed in West Germany. But while he was there, a drug problem dating back to high school eventually developed into a schizophrenia diagnosis and, of course, a discharge. This meant that he left the military in 1973. It is important to note that, so far as we're aware today, schizophrenia is not caused by drug use, but drug use can exacerbate the symptoms, which may be why Gary punched a police sergeant in 1973 and then groped his cousin's wife several months later. Unfortunately, the next few years saw Gary continue to act out as a result of this disorder, and that manifested in a few different ways, including a burglary aimed at recovering a ring for Satan, 3 escapes from psychiatric hospitals, and an on-foot journey from Portland, Oregon, back to his home in Maryville, over 500 miles away. Specifically, that's a distance on foot of 540 miles. That is utterly insane. He survived by stealing milk off of porches and, stealing snacks. What I will point out is that Gary, even when fully schizophrenic, was very resourceful, if also incredibly dangerous. Both of those things will become relevant later in the story. By 1978, however, Gary was doing very well and had been for about 2 years, never missing a single dose of his twice daily Stelazine and Cogentin. Now, obviously, if you're anything like me, the names Stelazine and Cogentin mean nothing to you, which is why I decided to look up what they do. As it turns out, Stelazine treats the psychological symptoms of schizophrenia, which include visual, auditory, and sensational hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech, abnormal movements, and a lack of ability to function normally. Cogentin, on the other hand, treats the physical symptoms that are related to the psychological symptoms, as well as also doing some things to treat the side effects of Stelazine. Stelazine can sometimes cause involuntary movement, twitching, things like that, and it's been shown that Cogentin can improve focus in schizophrenic individuals. So, again, by 1978, Gary was doing really well. He had been working for his father for a couple of years, and he had a relatively normal social life. He had friends, he went out, he drank, he had fun. He was a relatively normal guy for all intents and purposes. And this was much the same behavior that he had displayed back before his diagnosis. When he was in high school, he sang in a band and he was a football player. And he was primarily connected to the other 4 members of the group through an organization called Gateway Projects, which helps to provide enrichment activities for people with mental disabilities, as well as helping them to find jobs and job training. For example, today, the rate of employment amongst people with mild intellectual disabilities is around 80%. As for the specifics of the rest of the group, their IQs were all between 50 and 69, with the exception of Jack Hewitt, who was somewhere in the 40s. Going down the list, Jack Madruga, who was 30 years old and worked as a dishwasher at the Sunsweet Growers, was not diagnosed with anything, but was generally considered to be a little on the slower side. All that this meant was that it took him a little longer than most people to learn how to do specific tasks and understand specific concepts, but once he had learned them, he was able to perform them very well. As I mentioned before, he served in the Army from 1966 to 1968 as a truck driver, and as a result could drive himself around perfectly fine. He was one of 2 men in the group, who had a driver's license, the other being Gary Mathias. And, Gary could do his own banking. This is a guy who, once he got going with something, had a good head on his shoulders. He was most likely the second most intelligent of the group. Madruga was also very close friends with another member of the group, Bill Sterling, a 29-year-old who had trouble holding down a job and was in fact diagnosed as being mentally, intellectually disabled. Some specifics about him that are relevant to this case are that he was not really a fan of the outdoors. He didn't like the cold, he didn't like being in the woods, he wanted to stay home. He was a, I want to be inside somewhere or I want to be inside my house kind of guy. In 1978, he was not actively working a job, but he did
What am I going to do with you? Oh, here's an idea. Sure. Why not? Yeah, Grammarly, whatever.
In 1978, he was not actively working a job, but he did receive a $15 a week allowance from his parents. Both Madruga and Sterling were friends with Ted Dwyer, a 32-year-old, who his main problem was that he seemed to lack common sense. A couple of the examples given are that he once bought $100 worth of pencils for no conceivable reason, and that's about $600 in today's money. So that's so many pencils. And one of the other occasions that was, in my opinion, also very important to this case, was that at one point his family's home was actively burning down, and rather than leaving, he laid in bed. And when his brother came in to get him and say, "Hey Ted, man, we got to get out of the house, it's burning down," Ted just kind of was like, no, I'm tired, I need to be up for work in the morning, I'm just going to sleep. So as you can imagine, this is a guy who lacked self-preservation instincts. If you're noticing that things are starting to pile up, which are very relevant to the case, you're correct. Oh, also, he didn't get stop signs. He understood that you were supposed to stop, but he didn't get one. I'm not making fun of these individuals. I understand mental disabilities. I just want you guys to understand very clearly where these men's gaps were. The final member of the group was 24-year-old Jack Hewitt, who was basically like a shadow to Wire. He went everywhere Wire went. As I mentioned, his IQ was likely somewhere in the 40s, and he could not read, write, or dial a telephone. And when he would have conversations on the phone, they were typically extremely short. He would say exactly what he needed to say and then hang up. Or if he was talking to someone, say his girlfriend, then he usually wouldn't speak much. He would just listen, because the concept of a telephone speaking to somebody who was not physically there through a receiver was not something he could comprehend, according to his parents. Gary had met the other four about a year and a half before the events of February 1978, and they were scheduled to play in a basketball tournament together on the 25th. They were very excited because this basketball tournament, if they won, came with a very cool top prize. They would get to go to Los Angeles for a week and hang out with the cast of the TV show All in the Family. This was a Special Olympics kind of tournament, so every single team they would be playing against were also special needs, and this group entered as the Gateway Gators. And this basketball team was determined to win. They were going to be there, they were going to win that game, and they were going to go to LA. Gary bugged his mother for a week prior, making sure that she ensured everything was on time, and he was definitely going to be there when he had to be there. And Ted Dwyer was very obsessive about making sure his brand new high-top sneakers were in tip-top shape for the game. Closely related to their excitement about the tournament was their excitement about a basketball game up at Chico State. This was the Chico State Wildcats playing against the UC Davis Aggies, and the Aggies were the boys' favorite team. They left Yuba City around 5:30 p.m. on February 24th, 1978, to drive the hour or so up to Chico, where they watched the game, had a great time, their favorite team won, and then afterwards they left and stopped by a local store to get some snacks. This was Bears Market in Chico, California. The boys walked into the store just before 10 p.m., and the cashier remembered all of this vividly because at the time she was kind of irritated. She was trying to close up the store, and now these five guys walk in, they're all over the place. She could tell that there was something a little off about them, but not in a dangerous way, and she was just kind of annoyed that they were prolonging her shift. But beyond them just seeming a little off due to their mental disabilities, she didn't notice anything that seemed wrong with them. As they just went in, they purchased a Hostess cherry pie, a Langendorf lemon pie, a Snickers bar, a Marathon bar, 2 Pepsis, and a few pints of milk, which sounds like a normal Wawa run to me. After they finished purchasing the snacks, she saw them climb into the Montego and drive off in the direction of Yuba City. Now, if the group had left Bears Market in Chico at exactly 10 p.m. or even up to 10:15, then they should have been back in Yuba City by 11 p.m. They were not, and it was funny to Sterling, Bill's mom, who was the first to notice, because she had woken up at 2 a.m. and realized that her son was not home. She immediately called Mrs. Madruga, who confirmed that her son Jack was not home either, and then at 5 a.m. she received a call from Mrs. Wire saying, "Hey, are your kids home?" And she had to say, "No, they're not, and neither is Wire, so something's up." Following that, the Wires and the Madrugas checked in with the Matthias and Hewitt families, who confirmed that their kids weren't back either. The 5 families, hoping that, the boys had just gotten sidetracked, that it was no big deal, they would come home eventually, maybe the car had broken down. They waited all day until they eventually called in a missing persons report around 8 p.m. on February 25th. The first place that anybody looked for them was along Route 99, the main highway route between Chico and Yuba City. And the thing about 99 is that once you get on 99, if you're going to Yuba City, you don't get off. You go straight through. 99 runs through Yuba City down towards Sacramento. So they figured if the car had broken down and the boys were somewhere along the highway, well, 99's the first place to check. But they weren't along 99, nor were they along 70, or any of the other highways in the area for that matter. It wasn't until the 27th that someone finally made a connection that gave anybody any indication of where the boys had gone. And that was a ranger by the name of Burris, who had received a report that a car had been seen around 9 a.m. Saturday along Oroville-Quincy Highway up in Plumas National Forest. The resident who had seen it, Mr. Neal, didn't really think much of the car being there, nor did Burris when it was first reported, because the fact of the matter is, people went up there to ski and snowboard and just hike around the backcountry all the time, so it wasn't uncommon to see a car with nobody in it parked on the side of the road. It was only when the missing persons bulletin got out that he realized that the car that had been reported and the car he had seen himself was a 1969
Architecture tells a story of those that came before us. I can get an understanding of how people lived, what people felt was important, times that they were in, and that's why I love to travel to different places. To say San Antonio is unique is an understatement. It literally takes your breath away. My partner and I were designing our new home and we decided to go to San Antonio because we really wanted to.
That's great, I don't care.
Once he made that connection, the alarm bells started to ring, and they were right to ring because it was, in fact, the correct Mercury Montego. It was Madruga's car. Beyond just the license plate, it was very obvious it was their car because inside the vehicle were packages from the snacks, their empty drinks, and a folded-up road map of Northern California, as well as a scorecard from the game. However, not a single one of the boys was in the car, and there was no indication of where they had gone. There were tracks leading in multiple directions, all up and down the side of the road, but all of them led to dead ends. The car itself was located at about 4,400 feet in elevation, just north of a location called Rogers Cow Camp. And this is also just north of what used to be a community called Merrimack. This location is very remote along an old stagecoach route about 10 miles deep into the forest. The road to get to where they were, which today is a paved highway, at the time was an unpaved and relatively unmaintained route full of ruts and potholes. And to make matters worse, there were 10 to 18 inches of snow covering the roadway in the exact location where they were found, which was basically just inside the snow line, about 200 yards. Curiously, there was no damage to the undercarriage of the vehicle, despite the fact that Yuba County Sheriff's Deputy Lance Ayers told reporters that driving that road at night at any speed would tear the bottom out. Because of this, investigators surmised that whoever had driven the car up there either did so extremely carefully or was extraordinarily familiar with the territory. Now, Jack Madruga, the owner of the car and the one driving it because he never let anybody else drive his car, did not know this area at all. As far as anybody knew, he had never been there. He was a very careful driver, but he was so careful a driver that he would have never driven up that road in the first place. In fact, he had once refused to drive a friend home because the road to his house was too bumpy. The car being found was a good thing, but it also meant they had to restart the search entirely because they'd been looking in the wrong place. And because everything about the situation was just so strange, the families and the police began to suspect that foul play might have been involved. And the families were able to put up a $1,215,000 reward for the boys' safe return. At that point, once the reward was offered and the bulletin was plastered all over the area, the reports of sightings began to trickle in. One of the earliest reports turned into police was that of a man named Joseph Schoen, who was a 55-year-old Sacramento resident who owned a vacation trailer up on the mountain. He told investigators that he had been up on the mountain that night because he had family coming to visit, and he wanted to go check out where the snow line was so the kids could play. However, sometime between 6 and 6:30 p.m., his car had become stuck in the snow. Realizing he was stuck, he got out of the car and for about half an hour tried to push it out of the snow back down the hill a little ways. But due to the strain, he ended up having a heart attack. Heart attacks are, of course, not always immediately lethal and sometimes are just a really bad experience, and that's how this one went. So, according to Joseph, he laid in his seat just trying to rest and recoup enough so that once he felt better, he could go back down the mountain. And according to one of the reports he gave police, he spent several of those hours vomiting and defecating all over the side of the road because he was so sick. According to the story that was reported March 3rd, 1978, Joseph Schoen had been laying in his car just trying to recover and waiting for it to be warm enough to walk down the mountain when he noticed that somebody had pulled up behind him. He heard whistling somewhere outside of his car and looked out to see that there was a pair of headlights about 20 feet behind his vehicle. Because he was, of course, in a pretty bad situation, he rolled down his window and called for help. And when he looked out, he could see that there were people out there, but he couldn't really put his finger on how many. He said it was between 2 and a dozen. When he got out of the car to ask for help, he said that the lights shut off and everybody went quiet. And of course it was dark, so he wasn't about to go investigate. Now, the reporting differs on some of the specifics here, and you have to really go to the police reports in order to get any coherent details. But he did apparently tell his wife that it wasn't just one car behind him, that in fact there was also a pickup truck sitting at an angle behind the other car. However, he would later tell police and the media that he probably just hallucinated the pickup truck, it was probably never there, and, he was in a bad mood. In his final interview with police, he would confirm that he saw a pickup truck. Joseph Schoen's story hit the media on March 3rd, and the next day, March 4th, there were reports of further sightings. One of the reports was from Oroville and alleged that a woman by the name of Sheila Brandon had seen 2 of the men, specifically Matthias and possibly Hewitt, walk into the Russell Inn Motel to ask for odd jobs. They came in on the 28th and the 2nd, and she said that they had come from the north end of the street and were headed south down towards the bus stop. The second set of reports came from a shop in nearby Brownsville, where a woman by the name of Carol Waltz reported seeing Hewitt and Matthias. According to her, the men bought burritos, chocolate milk, and sodas, which is consistent with what they purchased at Bears Market. And then another woman, a patron of the store, who was in there on the Sunday that the men were allegedly seen, the alleged sightings were to the 25th and 26th. She went in on Sunday, and she was able to tell police that she believed she had seen 4 of them for sure. And then she wasn't sure about Matthias. She said that there was a man inside with glasses, but she couldn't really describe him beyond that. When she was given photos to look at of the men, she identified Hewitt and Madruga as being near a telephone booth. Hewitt actually in the telephone booth, making a phone call. Keep that in mind. And then Wire and Sterling were standing in the parking lot, and according to her, they were driving a red pickup truck. Now, we should recall that, according to Schoen's story, he saw a rust-colored pickup truck behind the Montego. I guess I should clarify that in the case of Schoen's story, he saw everything happen, but then he went back to sleep for a...
Cheesy, thin, and crispy. Cheez-It Snapped.
This account really is giving high earnings. So sign up today to earn high interest on your savings with EQ Bank.
For a little while. He ran out of gas around midnight, and then he started to get cold around 2 a.m. And then about 4 a.m., he decided he was going to try and walk back down the mountain, arriving at a bar called the Mountain House, according to him, at 10 a.m. As he was walking down the road towards Mountain House, immediately after getting out of his car, he saw a 1969 Mercury Montego. It was turquoise as the Montego. So now we have 2 red pickup truck sightings, 1 sighting of the Montego, and 3 sightings of the boys. Unfortunately, the trail seems to have gone completely cold after Brownsville, with police puzzled as to how the boys had gotten up onto the mountain, when and how they'd gotten back down the mountain, and where they'd acquired a red pickup truck. All of this was especially strange considering that had Matthias made it back down the mountain, he would have definitely known how to call for help, and he would have known to call for help. Now, he hadn't been off of his medication long enough for symptoms to set in, but had the symptoms begun setting in, he would have become very violent. So if he was in an area where he could take a bus back home, or he could go to a hospital, or he could make a phone call, any of those things, then Gary Matthias would have turned up. Of course, he didn't ever show up, so for months, the police chased down leads all over the country, from Sacramento to Ontario down to Tampa, but every single time, they came to the conclusion that this was not the boys they were looking for.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
The search eventually became so desperate that Deputy Ayers, looking for any possible avenue to find these guys, who, by the way, he had been in high school with some of them, he was exhausting every resource, which even included psychics. One of those psychics told him that the boys had actually been murdered in a 2-story red house in Oroville that was numbered either 4723 or 4753. Deputy Ayers scoured the streets of Oroville looking for any house that could possibly match that description, only to find that no such house existed. He was one of the people hit hardest by all of this, partially because of his connection to the boys through high school. We do talk a lot on this channel about times that police dropped the ball, about times that they failed. Thankfully, I can say with confidence that Deputy Ayers was one of the good ones. As it turned out, it would be the weather that brought warmth to a case that grew ever colder, as the summer heat melted the snow covering the mountains in Plumas National Forest. On June 6, 1978, the Sacramento Bee reported the first break in the case. A group of 3 motorcyclists going down some of the backcountry roads had discovered that there was a Forest Service trailer with a broken window. And when they went to check it out, they realized that it smelled horrible in there. They looked in the window, and what they saw was the deceased body of Ted Wire. The trailer itself was about a mile down the road to the west of the very remote Daniels Inc. campground, and about a mile and a half south of the main road, that Oroville-Quincy Highway. As the crow flies, the trailer was about 5.5 miles from where the Montego was located, in an area only accessible by unmarked gravel roads. And despite a valiant effort from 3 counties' sheriff's departments and search and rescue teams, that region had never been checked because it was just so far away from the Montego. They figured that nobody could possibly have gotten there from that car in those conditions. In order to get there, you had to go uphill and then split off of the road to go downhill about 1,200 feet before going back uphill. And the entire route to get there takes you deeper into the mountains. When Ted was found, he was fully clothed, wrapped in about 8 layers of sheets, with his belongings sitting on a table next to him, and included amongst those were a partially melted candle, and there was a gold wristwatch that was missing its crystal, but that did not belong to Ted Wire. Specifically, the wristwatch was a Waltham brand. Ted, who was 5'11", had lost 80 of the 200 pounds he carried with him into the park that night. As for how he died, it was unclear if it was exposure or the gangrene that had taken hold in his feet, causing blood poisoning. But what was really odd about Ted's body, aside from where it was located, was that he'd been missing for 14.5 weeks, and his beard growth suggested he'd been alive for at least 8 of them. It was also possible, based on the beard growth, that he had survived a full 13 weeks. Basically that he was alive 10 days before he was discovered. Now, again, it's more likely that he died in 8 weeks, but again, it's possible he lasted that long. Another important aspect is that, given the state of his body, he could not have wrapped himself in the sheets, because it would have just been extraordinarily painful. He also can't have possibly moved enough to keep himself alive during that time. That meant that somebody else had to have been in the trailer with him, and the big question now was, who are they, and where are they now? The answers came pretty rapidly, because the very next day, the bodies of Madruga and Sterling were found along an access road leading to the trailer. And that's an access road that the boys should have had no idea was there. Madruga's body had been partially scavenged, he was missing his right arm, and he was clasping his watch in his left hand. And he was found laying face up. Sterling, on the other hand, was a little bit harder to identify, as extensive scavenging had rendered his remains skeletal. The way he was initially identified, there were later dental records used, but the way he was initially identified was by a picture of his sister's that was in his wallet. And he was found on the other side of the road from Madruga, though investigators speculated that they likely died side by side, and it was animals that pulled them apart, as both the men had been basically inseparable in life and were unlikely to leave each other behind. They believed that the most likely outcome was that one of the men had succumbed to exhaustion or hypothermia, something like that, and the other waited with him until he met the same fate. I'll get into some more details about the exact locations of the body a little bit later. Now, tragic as these discoveries...
I like it. It's mine. The prices blow my mind. I feel so rich. I feel like a billionaire.
Ooh. Ooh. Actually, that's an idea. Rip this off right quick.
Download the Temu app and shop like a billionaire.
As a society, we value being proactive. We put on sunscreen. Your teeth are no different. New Pronamel Active Shield.
I'll get into some more details about the exact locations of the body a little bit later. Now, tragic as these discoveries were, it did give the Hewitt and Matthias families an opportunity to search a very specific area for their kids. Hewitt's family patrolled the area along the road leading up to the trailer, and on June 7th, one of his family members came across his remains. Specifically, somebody spotted Jack Hewitt's clothes, although sources differ on who particularly it was. According to some of the reports, Jack Hewitt's father, Jack Hewitt Sr., saw his son's jacket, approached it, lifted it up, and watched as his son's spine fell out. According to other reports, his brother-in-law found his jacket, and there was no such dramatic moment of the spine. That left only one man, Gary Matthias, unaccounted for, and it had been 15 weeks since his last dose of antipsychotics. Even with all but one body recovered at this point, the mystery was still far from over, as the discovery of the car and the location of the trailer created more questions than it answered. Initially, they determined that it was possible all 5 men did make it to the trailer, with 4 of them then leaving. But as the investigation developed, they came to the conclusion that Madruga and Sterling likely died along the way to the trailer, and Hewitt may have made it or may have died also along the way. So where they netted out during the investigation was that Madruga and Sterling never made it to the trailer, whereas Hewitt, Matthias, and Wyatt did. The fact that some of them had made it to the trailer, which was well stocked with food, warm clothes, and even a butane heating system, and then they had simply seemed to leave it was puzzling enough. But the fact that they got to the trailer in the first place was straight up baffling, considering the location of the car by Rogers Cow Camp. In order to get there from Chico, the following has to have transpired. They would have left Chico on Route 99. They then would have gotten off 99 onto Route 70. Keep in mind, Route 99 takes them directly to Yuba City. So, they get off of Route 99, they get onto 70. They then turn east off of 70 onto 162, which becomes the Oroville-Quincy Highway as it heads into Plumas National Forest. They then would have had to pass out of Oroville, then go north up into the mountains.
Now,
when
what am I
every
going to do with this
single member
tiny
of the
severed
car
head?
would have known they were supposed to be on a flat highway. And then after that, upon getting onto Oroville-Quincy Highway, which at the time was Oroville-Quincy Road and considerably less maintained, they would have had to drive about 30 miles, the last 6 or 7 of which were completely unpaved. That gets even more complicated when you map it out, considering the location where the Montego was found is about 2 hours from Chico if you're driving at that time of night, on today's roads, which again, are paved. Oh, and by the way, because this route is closed in the winter, so you can't use Google Maps to get it from like a leave now situation in February when we're shooting this video, I had to use July weather. So in July, driving at that time of night, it takes between 90 minutes and 2 hours. This was February. So obviously, there's a lot of gaps here, and we have to look at what we do know, or at least what we think we must know. And for that, we can start with Schoen's story, which, if he's to be believed,
Here we go.
he encountered the Yuba County 5, or at least he encountered somebody near the Yuba County 5's car around 11:30 p.m. on the 24th. This was in the location the Montego was found, and it was about 90 minutes after they were known to have left Chico. If the Montego was really there when Schoen said it was, that means that Jack Madruga drove the distance from Chico to Rogers Cow Camp in 90 minutes, which does not leave enough time for him to drive carefully enough to avoid damaging the undercarriage of the car. That, of course, is if Schoen was correct about the car being there at 11:30 p.m. However, even if Schoen was hallucinating, wrong, or straight up lying, the car was definitely there by 9 a.m. on Saturday morning, because that's when Mr. Neal saw it. In that case, there's theoretically enough time for them to get there and to drive very carefully, but again, the unfamiliarity with the road and the fact that it would have been very, very dark out still leaves the lack of damage to the undercarriage of the car a little bit suspect. It also still leaves the question of why did they take that road in the first place? One possible explanation is that they had stopped off of the highway to pay a quick, unannounced visit to some of Gary Matthias's friends who lived in Forbestown, and that as Jack was driving towards that Forbestown turnoff, he simply missed it and accidentally kept going up into the mountains. From there, he would have continued driving up the mountain until he eventually became mired in the snow around Rogers Cow Camp. Missing the turnoff is plausible, but driving a further 25 miles and then 6 of those being on unpaved roads deeper and deeper into the mountains really is not. And with the tournament the next morning, it seems unlikely that the boys would have decided to make an unplanned, unannounced visit around 11 p.m. to people who were only friends with one member of the group. Then there's the alleged sightings in Brownsville, which is 45 miles and about an hour's drive south of where the Montego was found on February 25th at 9 a.m. The sightings were said to have occurred on the 25th and 26th in the middle of the day, and the first one on the 25th was around lunchtime, so we're going to say 11 to 12 p.m., which means that if the boys really were stuck up on that mountain at 11:30 p.m. the night before, and if Joseph Schoen did in fact see them, then they had just 12 hours to get 45 miles down to Brownsville. The only feasible way that they could make that journey is if somebody picked them up and drove them there. However, if a Good Samaritan had come by, picked the boys up, driven them down to Brownsville, and then just let them go, well, then somebody probably would have come forward to admit to that. This suggests that if they were picked up, then it wasn't by somebody innocent, and this is foul play. On the other hand, if they walked, we have to look at the circumstances, because while I can't find...
Helps 3 issues with 1 answer. I recommend Sensodyne Sensitivity Gum and Enamel.
What does it take to be a leader in electric vehicles? At Hyundai, it takes a commitment to quality, a desire to innovate, and show the world the...
On the other hand, if they walked, we have to look at the circumstances, because while I can't find exact weather history data, I was able to track down the current temperature at Bucks Lake, and this was on February 3rd, 2024, in the late afternoon. And at that point, it was 30 degrees. Because there was no historic data for the exact location where they went missing, I had to use Sacramento. So I compared Sacramento at the same time on the same day, February 3rd, 2024, that's comparing Bucks Lake to Sacramento. And what I did was I said, all right, Bucks Lake, 30 degrees. Sacramento, 54 degrees. Obviously, this is not a great sample size, but it's the best I have to work with, which means that going by just one day, Sacramento is 20 to 30 degrees warmer than Bucks Lake. So, at this time, it was probably around 30 degrees at Bucks Lake, probably between 30 and 40. And that's, again, during the daytime. So, if these boys at 11:30 p.m. on February 24th, 1978, wearing their t-shirts and Converse, attempted to walk down that mountain, they would have been utterly freezing. And in order to walk all the way to Brownsville, they would have had to have passed multiple places where they could have sought shelter. And I'm not talking about abandoned cabins. I'm talking about bars. I'm talking about lodges. They would have come across actual shelter multiple times on their way down. But even assuming they did somehow make it to Brownsville, it still doesn't make sense that they didn't get home. And the reason I say that hinges on Gary, who we know made it to the trailer. So, if we look at Gary's situation, say he gets to Brownsville, there's a telephone, he is not intellectually disabled. He is a relatively smart guy. He's average. He's normal. So if they had made it down to Brownsville, Gary, who was not intellectually disabled and did have schizophrenia and knew he was a ticking time bomb if he didn't get his medication, would certainly have either sought to call his parents or sought medical attention. So with all of that in mind, really the only way they could have possibly gotten to Brownsville and not looked for help is if somebody drove them there, then took them back up the mountain, and did not report any of it. Alternatively, those Brownsville sightings could have been simply an attempt to get a cut of the reward, which at this point had grown to, I believe, $2,500. It also could have been a case of mistaken identity, or, a little bit more sinister, this could have been a deliberate attempt at misdirection, which would mean that whoever got rid of the boys was also connected to the store. Just given the distances involved here and how utterly disconnected everything is, seems very unlikely to me. One thing that really sticks out to me about this part is that the patron of the store in Brownsville, who said she saw 4 of the men, claimed that she saw Hewitt in the telephone booth having a phone conversation that lasted about 15 minutes. Keep in mind that Jack Hewitt did not know how to dial a phone, and according to his mother, his phone conversations never lasted more than a few seconds. At least not if he was actively participating. If he was making a phone call, he would have somebody dial the number, he would pick up the receiver, he would say what he needed to say, and he would hang up. The exception to this was if he was having a conversation with his girlfriend, but during those conversations, he was not typically talking, he was usually just listening. And his girlfriend never reported getting a call from him that day. Then we have the Oroville sightings 2 days later, and that is, of course, Sheila Brandon, who said that she saw 2 of the men come into the Russlin Motel to ask for odd jobs before they headed south towards the bus depot, which again, one of those men was tentatively identified as Gary Mathias. If Mathias had gotten to a bus depot, he would have gone home. And it's not just Gary that would have had the presence of mind to try and get home at that point. Madruga and Sterling also possessed the faculties to make that decision and get at least themselves home. Wire and Hewitt, on the other hand, probably lacked the critical thinking skills to do that themselves. Given the many inconsistencies here, as well as the location of the car and where the bodies were eventually found, in my personal opinion, it's very unlikely that they ever went to Oroville or Brownsville. But that still leaves a couple of important questions, one of which is how did they get to the trailer? There are a lot of possible routes to get from the Montego to the Forest Service trailer. The problem is that every single one of them is extraordinarily difficult on foot. And when I was trying to figure out which specific route they would have taken, it was very difficult, because all of the reporting from this time is incredibly inconsistent. Deputy Ayers says that it was 19.2 miles. Some newspapers said 19.4, others said 11, some said 12 to 13, one guy said 15 miles. I spent, I'm not kidding, 3 hours manipulating a map to try and figure out how 19.2 miles, the number given by Ayers, who seemed to be the most focused on the case, could possibly make sense. And then I went, you know what? I'm gonna go see if Missing Enigma figured it out. He did. Nick, you magnificent bastard, I should probably use you as a resource more often. If you haven't seen it, obviously it's in a very different style from the way we do our videos, but Missing Enigma has a fantastic two-part series on this disappearance, this case. He goes into a lot of detail. He had access to some documents that I did not have access to, and I will admit that I revised a lot of my stuff after watching his videos because he just had better information than I did. So if you're interested in something that's going to take you through, like, point by point by point by point, definitely go check out his video. I think it is a great resource for anybody interested in this case. And we'll leave a link in the description. Giving credit where credit is most certainly due, Madruga and Sterling were found about 3 miles south of the trailer as the crow flies, and about 6.5 miles on foot. This placed them about 11.4 miles away from the location of the Montego, and they were, as I said, about 50 yards apart when they were found due to scavenging.
There's no sweeter way.
Well, I thought that was the beginning of a horror movie, not a Sleep Country commercial.
Before, Madruga and Sterling both had all of their belongings on them, their wallets, and all of that. Madruga was grasping his watch in his left hand, and he still had the keys to the Montego in his pocket. Hewitt's body was closest to the trailer, about 2.5 miles to the southeast, along a road that led away from the trailer, but also could have been the same road they took it to. Investigators believed that it was most likely that Hewitt had made it to the trailer and later left. So that all explains the route that they would have taken. They went north,
unless he had been off
Quincy,
his medication
right
for a considerable amount of time.
It down and around until it eventually snaked its way to this trailer.
And
so probably the next most important question to ask is, why did they get out of the car, which had enough gas to keep them warm through the night, and was, by comparison to just being out in the wild, safe? One possibility is related to a set of snowcat tracks left on February 23rd by a Forest Service vehicle. Perhaps the car got stuck, they got out, they started walking north for some reason. Perhaps they were looking for the cabin that Bill Sterling's family had stayed in 8 years prior, but Bill Sterling was notoriously hateful of the cold, so that seems a little odd to me. But point is, maybe they got stuck, got out, started walking north, saw the snowcat tracks, and decided, oh, we'll follow those. Those might lead somewhere. But again, this really suggests that Sterling had said, oh wait, I know where we are, despite having been there exactly once 8 years prior, and then said, against his own wishes to stay out of the cold, hey, let's go out in the cold. Wire also was of the same opinion as Sterling, that he did not like being out in the cold, and when you factor in the fact that Gary Mathias and Jack Madruga both had military training, they probably would have said, hey guys, no, we're staying in the car because it's warm and safe in the car and we can walk back in the morning. Essentially, if they'd become stuck, Mathias and Madruga would have known not to get out of the car and would likely have persuaded the rest not to do so either. Additionally, they both would have known, or at the very least Mathias would have known, that you don't look for help up the mountain. You look for help down the mountain. So absent any explanation for why they would voluntarily get out of the car, we have to assume that perhaps something compelled them to get out of the car. The question then is what or who? Now, one detail I neglected to mention until this point is that the driver's side window of the Montego was found rolled down, which is a position that Madruga would have never left it in, but also suggests some other things. If Schoen's recollection was correct, and there was a pickup truck there with the Montego, then it's possible that somebody came upon the boys, realized they were stuck, offered them a ride, and then took them down the mountain. He did say at one point that somebody had shown their flashlight into his vehicle, but that the windows were all fogged up and maybe whoever shone the flashlight in didn't see him. As for the boys over in the Montego, well, that would explain why the window was down, it would explain the lack of tracks leading north, and it would explain why they got out of the car in the first place. However, if the person who offered them a ride was a good Samaritan and did in fact take them somewhere safe, well, then they probably would have come forward to say so.
Wonder if the Samaritan brought him to the shack and left him there.
North, somehow, perhaps because it was a pickup truck, managing to navigate the snow-covered roads, well, Gary Mathias, being the most intelligent of the group and having training, would have likely known, should have known, that rescue was going to be down the mountain, not up it, as I said. So if somebody did pick the boys up, Gary should have expected that they would be going down the mountain. And if this was a bad actor taking them further up the mountain, he likely would have recognized this. Then, either due to his normal level of intelligence or his paranoia as an aspect of his schizophrenia, less likely because he was medicated at the time, he may have recognized that something was wrong with them going up the mountain and encouraged everybody else to jump out of the vehicle. This is what happened that would have occurred about 5.5 miles from where the Montego was located, and they would have hopped out onto a forest road, which is labeled as 23N61Y. As far as I can tell, this must be where the snowcat tracks were. Maybe Gary saw that route, said, hey, everybody jump out, and we're going to run down. From there, Madruga and Sterling made it about 6 further miles before succumbing to the cold 11.4 miles from the car. And this was at about an elevation of 5,000 feet. We also know that somebody has to have made it to the trailer with Ted for several reasons. One of which is that he was in no condition to take care of himself for the 8+ weeks that he survived. It seems likely that the 3 survivors made their way to the trailer, at which point Gary broke into it and unlocked it from the inside. I say Gary because wire was too big to fit in through the window, and Hewitt wasn't good at performing complex tasks. The only alternative to the 2 aforementioned possibilities, which are that they voluntarily got out of the car despite Gary's better judgment, and that they were kidnapped from the location of the car, is that they were running from something, perhaps driving away from something, scared, being chased. And that would explain how they ended up where they were. Perhaps somebody chased them off of the highway, all the way up the mountain, but what it doesn't explain is how the car got there unscathed, because if they were driving fast up the mountain, the car would have bottomed out multiple times and possibly not even made it there. If we look at what Deputy Ayers said, which is that at any speed, at night, driving Oroville-Quincy Road would tear up the undercarriage of a car, we can see that it's utterly impossible that they would have been chased up the mountain without damaging the vehicle. But if they somehow did, we can assume that from there it was likely a similar route to everything else we could conjecture. They went 5 miles uphill, ran into the snowcat tracks, and then headed down the mountain until they eventually reached the trailer. Now the trailer is its own can of worms, as it was stocked with enough butane to keep them warm throughout the entire...
Lazy looking monster, what do you think? Turn them around though, you get more red. Ooh, that was a... what was that?
Butane to keep them warm throughout the entirety of the winter. It also had a year's supply of food and water and basic medical supplies. Yet when investigators arrived, none of that had been utilized. Inside the trailer, they had found the 2 to 6 weeks deceased Ted Wire, some of his belongings, that gold wristwatch, as well as a locker full of other non-perishable foods, heavy clothing, blankets, a fireplace with wood, and plenty of matches and paper. Now, I will admit that there is not a single contemporary source saying there was a fireplace in the trailer. However, the fact that they mentioned there was firewood leads me to believe that there probably was a place to burn it. Along with all of that, they found 31 opened and consumed cans of C rations, which are an old standardized military field ration kit, the predecessor to the modern MRE. If you've ever had an MRE, whether it was in training, in a survival situation, out in the field in the military, I would love to know what your worst experience was. Everyone can argue over what the best thing to get in your MRE is, but the stories that are really fun are what the worst ones. Anyway, getting back to the story, which is, of course, a tragedy, and I'm not meaning to make light of it, it's just read about the worst things to ever happen to people every day of my life, so I gotta bring some levity into the situation. But anyway, the problem is, that's it for the trailer. The only thing I can say is important other than that is that they found Gary Mathias's sneakers, and they did not find Ted Wire's boots. What baffled investigators and baffles me is that they did not turn on the butane, they did not open a food locker with, again, enough meals to last them the entire year, they didn't light a fire anywhere, they didn't change into the heavy clothing that was in the trailer, and 2 of them appear to have left. Now, the first big question associated with this is, why did they not turn on the butane heat and lights, and why did they not light a fire? And there are, of course, a couple of possibilities for this. For example, if they were being chased, or if Gary believed they were being chased, then he might not want to turn on the heat or light a fire because exhaust or smoke could attract people to their location. It's also possible, of course, that because of the snow covering the butane tank, Gary simply never found it and therefore couldn't turn it on. There are a couple of issues with that, though, because it appears that they had broken open a storage cabin, and you would think that Gary might have made, at least a once-over of the trailer to figure out if there was a butane tank. Either way, it doesn't make sense if this was not about being chased that Gary wouldn't have attempted to light a fire somewhere. Even if there wasn't a fireplace, you would think that he would find some way to keep warm. So why people left the trailer and why the food locker hadn't been opened, in my opinion, is directly linked to who was in the trailer and how long they were there for, which of course has been disputed. Some have suggested that Hewitt never made it to the trailer, because we know Gary has to have made it to the trailer, and the 31 C rations were barely enough for 2 people to make it the 8+ weeks that Ted Wire would have lived. The problem is that if Hewitt did not make it to the trailer, it creates a logistical issue. Someone must have stayed in the trailer with Ted Wire for several weeks, possibly even until the moment he died. Because without somebody there to feed him and give him water and everything, he would have died within a week. And while the human body can survive on water alone for several months, depending on how much fat you have on your body, keep in mind, Wire was 5'11", 200 pounds, and lost 80 of them during this period, he actually had a history of having no self-preservation instincts. And his feet were gangrenous to the extent that he can't possibly have moved around taking care of himself. Even if he had thought to drink water, he wouldn't have been able to get to it. That means that somebody must have been in there aiding him, giving him water for between 7 and 12 weeks. This is because after a week without water, you will die. Now, the people who believe Hewitt never made it to the trailer say that it was Gary that was taking care of Ted Wire. But in my opinion, that is based upon a misconception that Gary took his medication weekly and therefore could have probably lasted a month or more before he began to deteriorate. In reality, according to Gary's stepfather, Edward Klopp, Gary took his medication twice daily, 3 pills in the morning and 2 at night. And while Gary's doctor said he could probably go a month between doses before you start to see a serious, severe change in his personality, his stepfather disagreed and said, no, after 2 weeks, he'd be in bad shape. For my part, I'm going to take the experiential opinion of Edward Klopp over the theoretical opinion of Gary's doctor. If we're talking about 2 weeks here, the only way that Ted survives for that long and Gary has the presence of mind to pack up the blankets and flashlights that were found a couple miles northeast of the trailer and believed to have been dropped by him because nobody else could have possibly done it. They were from the trailer. In my opinion, the only way that those 2 things are possible is if Hewitt was there too. Those 31 C rations wouldn't have needed to feed 3 people for 2 months because Gary, knowing that he had a limited time before his illness overtook him, would have left within days to go get help. He likely took Ted Wire's boots to replace his own sneakers because they would have handled the terrain better, and then hiked off northeast because if there was a map in the trailer, it likely would have shown the hospitality centers at Bucks Lake just a day's walk to the northeast. We're talking about 5 miles as the crow flies. Seeing that, he likely would have made the decision that he could make it out there, he could get help, and Hewitt and Wire would only be alone a few days as long as he survived. However, for some reason or another, Gary never made it to Buck Flake or wherever else he would have been trying to go, leaving Hewitt and Wire alone in the trailer. It was likely Gary who set out the sea rations so that Hewitt wouldn't need to think. He could just open up the sea rations and feed them to his friend and himself. He likely wouldn't have thought to open the lock. And feed them to his friend and himself. He likely wouldn't have thought to open the locker because, as far as he was concerned, his friends didn't need to survive all that long. They needed enough food to make it the few days before help could arrive. However, when help never came, they ran out and they began to starve. Hewitt, not knowing to open the locker, and who knows what Ted Wire's state of mind was at this point, just wouldn't have done so. It also may have been Gary that wrapped Wire, by the way. Starvation can take months to kill you, so it seems possible that Hewitt stuck around with Ted Wire until Ted either succumbed to his gangrene via the blood poisoning, or he became unresponsive and Hewitt, not really realizing what was going on, decided to set off to get help himself. Of course, between starvation and his own disabilities, Hewitt didn't make it that far and he perished on the road out. With all of that in mind, it's not particularly suspicious or mysterious what happened to the Union County Five after they got on the road to the trailer. The real mystery is why they were so far off course in the first place and why they left the vehicle. In order to end up where they did, they must have gotten off the highway at Oroville. As we mentioned, one suggestion is that they were making a late-night unannounced visit to Gary's friends in Forbes Town. Now, late-night unannounced visits were not necessarily out of character for Gary, who had a tendency to be a little bit self-centered. And it is very easy to miss that exit onto Forbes Town Road. But the thing is, if you do miss the exit onto Forbes Town Road, you almost immediately cross a bridge over Lake Oroville. Gary would have known that Bidwell Bar Bridge was certainly not along the way to Forbes Town, and told Jack Madruga, hey, we missed it, turn around. Therefore, it seems unlikely that their misadventure was caused by Gary's wishes to see any of his friends, and something else must have happened. But putting aside why they would have gotten off at Oroville in the first place, let's look at how far up the mountain they were, and how the hell did they get there that fast. They left Chico at 10 p.m., and they were definitely up the mountain by 9 a.m. And if Schoen's story is to be believed, then they were up there as early as 11:30 p.m. on the 24th. But should we believe Schoen's story? Missing Enigma pointed out some important inconsistencies in Schoen's tale, especially considering the details regarding the red pickup. After he ran out of gas, Schoen had walked down the mountain to the Mountain House bar, sat down, ordered a glass of water and 2 aspirin, and then said, I should have done this 2 years ago. Nobody could tell particularly what it was that he was referring to, but he did ask the bartender, a Mrs. Aycock, if she could ask anybody to give him a ride back to his place. He did get a ride from a couple by the names of Robinson and Smith, and while in the car with them, he had some complaints, such as that he was chased up the mountain by somebody who was so close behind him that he couldn't turn around or stop. He also never mentioned a heart attack, just chest pain. Looking at the timing, he was seen leaving the Mountain House bar at 5:30 p.m. on the 24th, headed upwards to the north, and then he got stuck sometime around 6:30. The boys at this point were on their way to Chico. Missing Enigma suggests that Schoen may have driven up the mountain and actually been interested in seeing where the snow line was, but because he had had several beers, maybe he fell asleep in the car, took a little nap, and by the time he woke up around 11:30, there was a car right behind him, and he tried to go up to get out of the way, became stuck, became frustrated, and then everything went from there. I do see this as a possibility, considering that it matches his original story given to Robinson and Smith a lot better than the story he gave police. He did, however, before any of this was news about there being missing people, tell his wife about a red pickup truck. He then recanted that and said there was no red pickup truck, and then finally came back around and said, yes, there was in fact a rust-colored pickup truck parked at an angle behind the Montego behind me. He also told police that he left the car around 4 a.m. to walk down to Mountain House and arrived around 10 a.m., but the Mountain House staff said that he arrived around 9 a.m. All of that seems very plausible, and then of course there's the question of what did he mean by I should have done this 2 years ago? It could be completely unconnected, and in my opinion, Unless Shone premeditated this entire thing with people who knew these boys, knew their schedule, where they'd be, and had the ability to influence them to change course, Shone can't possibly have been involved. At the very least, he can't possibly have known they would be on the mountain that night. And of course, every single thing about this case is complicated by the fact that the Montego was on the mountain in the first place. That's because in order for them to not turn around at any point on their way up the mountain and go back the way they had come, they must have been being chased. However, if they were being chased, then there's no way that the undercarriage of the vehicle would be undamaged. Given that, they must not have been chased. However, if they weren't chased, it means they have no reason to have gone up the mountain, and all evidence indicates they would never have done so. That means that they didn't put the car there. But if they didn't put the car there, someone else must have. In order for someone else to have put the car up there, it means they must have been carjacked at some point. Either as they were leaving Chico, but of course the last time they were seen getting into the car in Chico, they drove off without incident, or perhaps they decided to stop for gas in Oroville.
Don't do it.
And
Don't
were
do it.
set upon
Don't
by
do
men, perhaps in a red pickup truck. If this did occur at a gas station, then obviously they couldn't just throw everybody out of the car right there and speed off, because, well, they might go to the police. So, one way to avoid an immediate police report as you're fleeing the scene would be to take the people in the car with you out into the wilderness, maybe. Maybe the people who carjacked them lived on the mountain, or maybe they figured these people will never make it off the mountain. Who knows? Perhaps they get taken up the mountain with the intention of driving them even further, maybe even over into Nevada, but they run into Shone's car up there, which is stuck, can't get past it.
With AutoTrader, you have all the tools available to you at your fingertips.
A Quiet Place Day 1 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. It's thrilling, terrifying. It will make your heart pound out of your chest. A Quiet Place Day 1 is streaming.
It doesn't work.
They run into Shone's car up there, which is stuck, can't get past it, and the boys, perhaps led by Gary, take the opportunity to jump out of the car and run off. They can't run back down because that's where the carjackers are, so they have to run up the hill. They get up the hill and they realize that if they're followed, they'll probably be followed along the main road, so they spot the snowcat tracks to the right and head down the mountain to the east. Now, of course, that doesn't totally cover the timing of when Shone said they were up there, because he gave the time of 11:30, but let's say his timing is off by 30 minutes to an hour. Suddenly, this is very feasible to get there in the time given if the people going up the mountain are familiar with the road. Obviously, all of that is completely unprovable, and the reason I put it forward is because this accounts for the most variables in the neatest way possible. It explains why they got off of 99. It explains how they ended up driving the car up the route they never would have gone. It explains why Shone saw them. It explains why there was allegedly a red pickup, and it explains why they went further up the mountain. However, the major thing that it does not explain is the fact that Madruga, according to reports, had his keys in his pocket. It could be possible that Jack Madruga had 2 sets of keys, and the car was found unlocked, which is a position that, according to his mother, he would never have willingly left it in. But, so far as I'm concerned, this all can work. The only thing that really needs to be explained here is the keys. This is not to say that there are no other possibilities.
Hey, if I jumped out of a vehicle and was running, I'd probably take the keys with me too.
It's just, as I said, in my opinion, the one that accounts for the most strangeness here. The one that explains the most questions. But if you think that I missed something, if you think that there was a detail that mattered more and I didn't give enough attention, or if I gave something too much attention, if you come across something that contradicts with good evidence, please let us know. Because we
don't use violence. Don't use violence. Don't use violence. I'm going to use violence.
Visit cases a year or two later just to see if we've learned anything new, and we just like to hear from you guys. So, if you have any interest in commenting, letting us know what we got right or wrong, please do so. Also, if you enjoyed the video, please drop a like. We appreciate it. If you're not subscribed to the channel, that's something you can do. I also highly, highly, highly recommend checking out both the Missing Enigma and Wendigoon's videos on this same subject. As I said at the very beginning of the video, Isaiah told me I had to do this, so I was going to at some point. I was just waiting until it had been a little bit longer. But yeah, he was. I have his blessing, I promise you. And really, if you haven't seen his video, his stuff is always fantastic, always top notch. Go and check it out. Missing Enigma.
I'm gonna get the drill.
So much more love. It's a criminally underrated channel. The guy's research skills are absolutely phenomenal, and the artistic style he has to go with his videos is incredible as well. We'd also like to give a thank you to FlexiSpot for sponsoring this video and partnering with our channel. We've had a pretty long-term working relationship with them, so if you're interested in acquiring their products, highly recommend. It's right here. The link is in our description and in the pinned comment. If you want to support our channel directly, you can subscribe to our Patreon or become a member here on YouTube. Patreon offers a $1 option, while YouTube does not, so keep that in mind. You can also check out our merch. That's in the little store shelf below the video that you're watching right now. You can get our coffee from Tableau Roasting Company. It's called Mount Pocono Perk. I designed it myself. It is phenomenal. I drink it every day of my life. If you haven't caught on to the fact that we only really accept sponsorships for things that we like, well, yeah. If you want more Lodge, get it? More Lodge? You can check out the Weird Bible, the History Hut, the Lore Lounge, and my personal channel, Mattis, where I do. That's currently the most active other one, where I stream 3 nights a week. It's Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. Done. Thursday nights are reaction streams, commentary on ghost videos, Friday nights are just multiplayer game streams with me and the boys. It's usually a good way to get some shenanigans in. And Tuesdays have been kind of a rotating cast. There'll be either music or a single-player game. I don't know exactly yet. Right now we're recording an album, so hopefully music. The best place you can get updates for this channel is our Discord server. You can reach that by going to https://ly/join the lodge. All right, that's
being interesting for
thanks for stopping by the Lore
a
Lodge.
fairy cage. I don't want to do another giraffe right now. But I think that might be it for the night. Shh, don't care. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 technically done. This one just needs some paint and some love. So I didn't do bad tonight. I could have done better, but I think it is what it is. So thank you guys for stopping by. I hope you have a good night, and I will see you next time.